up, everybody? I hope you're all having an extremely stationary day. When I awoke this morning, I thought I sensed some spinning. However, it turned out that was just because I forgot to set my coffee to brew last night, so my personal world was spinning for about 20 minutes while I slapped together a pot of joe. And in short order, I was reassured that the spinning was a direct result of coffee withdrawal. It was more of a subjective thing and nothing whatsoever related to axial rotation of the world. I wish you all a happy March and a happy 2016. Hopefully, you will all remain perpendicular to the horizon for the remainder of the year, but at least for the duration of this video, as it is a rule. I'll be covering two seemingly unrelated topics, well, at least two, in this video, although these topics might actually be related to some degree. Serendipity has graciously provided me with a few matters of debate and intrigue over the last week or so, and I've been so fascinated with this new evidence, but I need more information. Before getting started, I will ask, nay, beg, anyone planning to do a weather balloon launch, especially at night, even though that's technically illegal in the US, accidents happen. AM certainly could be confused with PM if you're not careful, just saying. But as you may know, a couple of weeks ago I was sent a link to a high altitude weather balloon footage, which was described to me by the alleged original poster, or maybe whom I just assumed was the original poster through some fault of my own. But I believed that this was sent to me from the original poster of the weather balloon footage as showing the sun reappear above the horizon after it was supposed to have set, or at least during a period when the sun should have been on the other side of the non spherical, hypothetically spherical planet Earth. I was told by the original ballooner, or whom I thought was the original ballooner, if that's even a word, that the video was definitely footage of the sun and the stars in the same sky. Um, I've been looking for that sort of thing and asking around because, and I've actually mentioned this in a couple of videos recently, that you can never seem to find high altitude footage of the sun and the stars in the same shot. So I typically give people the benefit of the doubt, and I assumed that since the person who I believed launched the balloon, he or she would have the best first-hand knowledge of things like the date, the time, the position of the sun, the latitude and longitude information, etc., etc. Unfortunately, after scouring the video several times, the only data points I could find were one, stratosphere, which is a 10,000 foot range of area above the face of the earth. So I believe it's 33,000 to 43,000, if I'm not mistaken. I believe on one of my previous videos I said 23 to 33,000. So we'll just say about 30,000 feet in a range of 10,000 plus or minus from that distance. So the stratosphere. That was what we were given in terms of where the footage was taking place, is from the stratosphere, which that's sort of nondescript, to say it mildly. Now, the second data point we had was the Iberian Peninsula, which is very, very general, a description of the area where Spain is found. That would be like if you ask me for my address and I say, like, sure, got a pen? Okay, I live in the American continental area. The third data point is that the video was shot during the Quadrantids event of January 2016 as viewed from somewhere near Spain. Now, I'm not trying to be rude to the original poster, and I suppose the person who launched the balloon was really only concerned with capturing the Quadrantids, and they weren't expecting to catch possible video proof that the sun or the moon are local objects and are not 93 million miles away or 240,000 miles away, respectively. Of course, I was excited about this video, especially after seeing it. However, I tried to remain as skeptical and objective and thorough as possible in terms of vetting the video information. Now, I had some trouble establishing when the Quadrantids event was visible from, the Iberian Peninsula, so from Spain. So a date certainly would have been nice to have overlaid in the video of that high altitude footage, along with time, AM or PM included for sure, or just 24-hour military time. Another really important piece of information, which should always be included in all weather balloon launches, are the exact longitude and latitude coordinates of the launch and pre launch reference points in terms of directional orientation. So, for example, before you launch the balloon, if you could position the camera towards the north and tell everyone, or put it overlaid in the video, this is north. Um, a compass and altimeter would be even better, but date, time, and directional orientation prior to launch are critical, and of course, the lat longitude information of the launch site. Now, time date stamp is important, and I think that if you're going to launch a weather balloon, you should have a time and date stamp clock running, in the bottom right corner of the video for the entire thing. And there's ways you can do that without getting too technical, but you can just sort of keep track of the time separately and overlay that into the video. So in case you do any cuts, people realize that they're not seeing things in sequence, but you're, going back and forth and looking at different events. Anyways, the reason I was originally so excited about this video was because this ballooner and we were chatting in a chat group towards the tail end of a live broadcast, and I really don't remember which one. I've done a lot recently. Now, since I can't remember his name, I'll simply refer to him as the ballooner, but I would really love to hear from the person who originally shot the Quadratids video from the, quote, stratosphere over the, quote, Iberian Peninsula during, quote, January of 2016. Since I'm terrible at staying current with emails, I would really appreciate it if you could call me at 864-603-3189. I'm on the East Coast USA. That's GMT -5, just so you know what time zone. But again, the person whom I was chatting with towards the end of that show, when you sent me the link to that video of the apparent sunrise at night, please give me a call so that we can, kind of talk this over and figure out what's going on. Now, the first thing you'll notice about the balloon video is the primary object. And when I say the primary object, I'm referring to the very bright light, which appears to be the sun, is intersecting with the horizon. Since there was not a launch clock, which should definitely be displayed in any balloon launch video, so we know the timeline of any events that occur, I will assume that the initial appearance of the primary object was in the correct spot in terms of a linear timeline. Although without a launch clock, we really have no way of telling whether the events depicted in the video were presented in a linear fashion. Of course, when you watch the original video, we totally get it that the dude launched the balloon first, and then way later, they found the balloon crashed. Now, that's obvious, the series of events in a very generally speaking term. I mean, obviously he launched it first, and then later on, at the end of the whole situation, they found the crashed balloon. So that's very obvious, but I'm talking about during the event. The video I was given a link to appeared to be presented in a linear fashion. However, there were a few cuts and replays at slower playback speeds, which is fine. However, that proves at least that the original video was not a completely linear representation of the timeline of events. So this is why, again, and I hate to beat a dead horse, but this is why it's so important to have an event clock, date timestamp overlaid in any launch video so that there's no guesswork involved as to the correct order of events. This is very important. Now, with all that being said, based on what was told to me by whom I assumed to be the original poster of the balloon launch, and it may have just been somebody who found that video and sent it to me. I may have just assumed that they themselves were the original ballooner, but I believe it was implied. Then again, when you're in some of these chats, if you're like in a live hangout doing chats, like you'll type something and then 50 comments will happen all at once, and so you'll never find a response. So I may have misconstrued some things. But with that being said, based on what was told to me by whom I assumed, was the original poster of the balloon launch, I was under the initial assumption that the primary object was indeed the sun. Now, prior to creating my quote, freak nighttime sunrise video featuring B.O.B.'s Flatline.
One hell of a check, ayy. I'm over here on this side of town. Come on over here, try to clown. Ayy.
The video, I indeed took some preliminary steps to try and verify whether that primary object was the sun or the moon. I have seen a great deal of footage from high altitude balloon launches, and typically the sun is extremely bright, and the moon, if visible at all, appears to be extremely dim and extremely small, almost as small as a background star. Now, you can look at the SpaceX video and see that from their alleged low Earth orbit, which is nearly identical to high altitude flight, by the way. However, any and all footage of the quote moon from well above the atmosphere shows the moon to be very, very small and indeed very faint. Much smaller than the sun appears to be. And we're talking about from high altitudes. From the ground, they appear to be about the same size. Now, this is what leads me to believe that while we're standing on the ground, our atmosphere and other more exotic layers of natural fields between your eye, which is a convex lens, and the moon probably act as sort of a convex lens. So let me restate that because our eyes are indeed convex lenses. But what I'm saying is the atmosphere and the magnetosphere and the stratosphere. And I hate to use the word sphere. You could say the ionoplane or the stratoplane. It's all the same thing, but we'll use the common vernacular. All of these different layers of media that the light from the moon is passing through appears to be acting as sort of a lens, or even a convex lens, or even a lens that makes the moon appear to be much larger than it actually is. Yet for some reason, the same effect doesn't appear to happen with the sun, although I have seen some high altitude balloon footage where the sun also appears to be very small. So it could be that standing here on the ground, when looking up at the sky, whether it's at the sun or the moon or possibly even the stars, we're looking at sort of a magnified version of everything, which makes tiny little dots and tiny little things makes them seem extremely large. Anyway, all of that is what leads me to believe that while we are standing on the ground, our atmosphere and the other exotic layers of natural fields between your eye and the moon probably act as sort of a convex lens, which would cause different frequencies of light to behave in a peculiar manner according to an observer on the ground, but light's just doing what light naturally does. It passes through media, and if it hits a certain type of media at a certain angle, it's going to react to that media and either change direction or diffuse into the visible spectrum, or there's lots of different things that light can do when passing through different sorts of media. Now, let me go on the record and state that I do not believe there is literally a glass dome or physical convex lens in the sky. However, I do believe there are a variety of layers which perturb light as it passes through said layers. For those of you who don't know, quote, visible light, end quote, is a tiny sliver of the entire electromagnetic spectrum, rendering us humans mostly blind and deaf. Same thing goes for sound waves. There could literally be a physical object 6 inches from your face screaming louder than a steam whistle. However, if the object somehow absorbed visible light as opposed to reflected it, and its vocal cords were attuned to a resonance outside the audible scope, you would literally never have a clue that that object was there screaming at extremely high levels every day, all day. You might experience some physical side effects from, being exposed to all of these, unnoticed stimuli. However, you'd never attribute said effects to something you've never seen or heard, of course. You would just think it was, I've got a migraine today, let me take a pill. So the sad truth is, this is exactly what's happening to us humans on a daily basis. If you ever research the sorts of frequencies used for cell phones, cordless phones, wireless mice, wireless mouses, I don't know, I've never really been sure about that, but wireless mesh, anything that sends and receives data via wireless bandwidths will, if modulated to be audible to the human ear, so you can sort of pass it through a filter that will sort of change the frequency so that you can sort of hear how it sounds if it was within our audible spectrum. But all these devices have that we have scattered all over the house, not to mention the 3 cell phone towers, which are always in earshot from anyone in America at all times, no matter what. It's as if we've got a dozen devices constantly screaming the most awful tones all day long, all night long, never ceasing. Well, if you turn everything off at night, I've found I sleep a lot better. If you typically sleep with all your devices on, your cell phones, your computers, laptops, cordless phones, etc., with all that stuff on at night, if you usually sleep that way, try this. Try shutting everything down for a couple nights in a row, just while you're sleeping. It's not like you're going to miss anything. And I can guarantee you just about that you will get the best sleep you've had in a long time. Now, one thing that I'll mention also is that the electric companies have recently started changing the old school analog meters that a guy actually has to physically walk out to your house and read the meter in order to figure up your power bill. They've started using instead these wireless meters, and they're even using it for our water in a lot of places as well for your water meters. But these wireless meters operate on a frequency that has been known to cause heart conditions and all sorts of because you got to understand our body is essentially an electromagnetic device, and when you start throwing all these interference wave signals through you, because yes, there's literally all sorts of different electromagnetic waves passing through you even right now. Myself, I've got a cell phone next to me, I've got a cordless phone, and I've got a modem about 6 feet away that's generating Wi-Fi signals. So just in my very room here, I've got all these different things that are literally screaming, but I don't hear it. So even though we can't see or hear everything, that doesn't mean that everything we cannot see or hear doesn't exist. The truth is, we're mostly blind and deaf, however, extremely arrogant in most cases, in terms of the typical belief that we've got it all figured out. And this statement certainly applies to scientists, most specifically theoretical physicists, who are to science as comic book authors are to news. But theoretical physicists are so far removed from the scientific method, as I've stated before, we must either change the definition of science or change the job description from theoretical physicist to something like a hypothetical surrealist. So I've come up with a few other examples. Putative hypnagogist, assumptive narcissist, presumptuous charlatan, imaginative harlequin, conjecturable egomaniacist, and I could go on, but it's really just too easy. Now, I consider another point we humans believe we've got it all figured out absolutely begins with the so-called Big Bang and continues through today as evolution. We clever and haughty humans have the audacity to believe that we're capable of understanding theoretical events which never happened 14 billion years ago. If you pause to think about this for a moment, the utter madness of the endeavor itself will always make an honest person chuckle, or at least place their tongue in cheek, if only for a moment. We clever and proud humans believe our so-called species are the pinnacle of billions of years of a soulless mechanical system randomly manifesting into existence as an explosion where the entire universe is purported to have been squished into the area the size of a golf ball, a pea, or even smaller still. Now, this random self-inventing system where over a dozen billion years ago, nothing exploded and eventually became an infinitude of galaxies full of stars and planets where everything in the known universe is a freak accident resulting from a theoretical explosion that did not occur, known as the Big Bang. Now, up until 1929, the scientific community all concurred that the galaxy we supposedly dwell in was the only so called galaxy, but according to this sci fi geek named Hubble, the little spirals in the night sky must be similar to the place we call home. For some reason, Hubble received the support, bravado, peer review, fortune, and glory akin to the hype and pre programming for modern day blockbuster movies. You see, during the days of Einstein and yes, Hubble, fiction television entertainment was not nearly as prevalent or readily available compared to today. There was a time not that long ago where the television did not exist, and people gathered at cinema theaters to download the latest government propaganda using the quaint old reel to reel projector. Now, although the quality and frequency of the government / military industrial complex propaganda has become far more pervasive to our privacy in the most recent years, completely disregarding the Constitution and our right as sovereign beings not to be brainwashed by large corporations and ultimately the military industrial complex. I won't go into detail here, but just as one example, many people don't realize that Walt Disney, which Disney is still one of the 6 corporations to own all mainstream media outlets, but Walt Disney was indeed a CIA asset, as well as a 33rd degree Freemason, and ultimately a goon and a puppet for the New World Order agenda and military industrial complex without a doubt. The point here isn't to rag on Disney, which I could do for hours and hours, since he was probably one of the worst influences on our culture ever, and his legacy continues to this day with this squeaky clean Uncle Walt propaganda still relevant, when in reality he was a tyrant and an alcoholic, although he fired employees caught with booze. Good old Uncle Walt was often accused as being, well, less than faithful to Mrs. Disney, and worst of all, he was a glory hog and a complete sellout. He had the finances and backing to hire all the best artists, animators, writers, and equipment of the time. However, because he was privy to unlimited wealth, no doubt related to his CIA connections, who can make $1 billion appear and disappear without a single question being asked, but I digress. Now, I would mention that real quick, similarly to Walt Disney being set up, propped up, funded, and ultimately propagandized through these mass media outlets, a similar thing occurred with NASA, where, Werner von Braun and other Nazis and other such essentially Freemasonic criminals were given the latitude, finances, and media propaganda in order to achieve really any end that they wanted to. In the case of Disney, it was to create basically an MK Ultra mind control program that would affect every single person in the world that owns a TV, and in the case of NASA, convince the world that they live on a spinning globe. Now, the government, and specifically covert black budget agencies such as the CIA and others, have always been the primary driving force behind all mass media, at least in the American history, at least in the recent American history for sure. But any attempts at private international exposure has always been folded into the giant conglomerate of which Disney Corp is one of the 6 members, one of the 6 major players, and any free press given an iota of national coverage.
Countries in the world. And you have 20.
Well, America was born on guns and whiskey.
America was born on guns and whiskey. America was born on guns and whiskey. America was born on guns and whiskey. America was born on guns and whiskey.
Right. But it's true we're a violent society.
Right. So you
but
accept that America has the most
knives
guns
kill
and the
3
most
times
gun
more.
murders.
Have you seen the FBI numbers? Knives, bats, rocks
Assault guns.
kill many times more.
Alex, let's talk
It's
about
not
the guns.
It's not the rock. It's not the knife. When a mother chops her kids up with a cleaver because she's on serotonin.
Alex, tell me why I'm wrong
When a mother chops her kids up with a cleaver because she's on serotonin.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
When a mother chops her kids up with a cleaver because she's on serotonin.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
When a mother chops her kids up with a cleaver because she's on serotonin.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
Why don't you want to get rid of the drugs? Because they're half your sponsors?
Stick to the subject.
America's number one cause of unnatural death now is suicide.
Okay. Alex,
not
let's try
automobile
again.
accident, not cancer, not...
You
Listen,
accuse me of attacking the Second Amendment of the Constitution.
I want to get people off pills that the insert says will make you commit suicide and kill people.
Alex, let's get about the Second
I
Amendment.
want to blame
Alex,
the real culprit.
Alex.
Suicide pills.
Alex.
Mass murder pills.
Okay, let me ask you one question.
Oh, I absolutely know. I have the police on CNN saying, get back, they're going to blow up 7. I have BBC reporting.
Who do you believe is behind
I
this?
have the proof. I heard them on CBS Radio.
Who, Alex?
They announced they blew up the towers on CBS Radio.
do you believe-
New Yorkers all saw it and heard it.
Alex, who do you
They
believe...
blew up Building 7.
Alex, who do you believe was behind it? The American government?
Criminal elements of the military-industrial complex, the same ones that staged Gulf of Tonkin, the same ones that staged Operation, the mass shootings of Operation Gladio.
Right.
Ooh, the CIA don't like this
Alex,
right now.
Do you mean that President Bush and his administration were behind 9/11?
I mean that even mainstream news reported that the hijackers were ordered to be allowed into the United States. Michael Springman, the head of the Visa Department, blew the whistle on that.
So the Bush administration was part of a conspiracy
Well,
to
he
murder,
should never let us tolerate
to murder thousands of Americans.
I can speak in this accent as well.
Yeah.
The
But is that what you
government,
believe?
Hitler firebombed his own Reichstag, Pierce, to bring in martial law in Germany, April 27th, 1933. Governments have staged terror attacks throughout history or allowed terrorists to attack as a pretext to invade and enslave the populations. I probably own more than 50 firearms. Many of them have increased in value 2, 3, or even 4 times. I sleep very comfortably outside Austin, Texas, knowing
Alex?
that I can defend my family.
Okay, Alex Jones. This is
Infowars.com.
This is the man who wants to deport me from the country for wanting to get rid
No,
of
it's
assault
to
rifles,
point out you're a
which
foreigner,
commit
a
mass
red coat,
outrages.
here telling us what to do.
Whatever.
Go back to where they took the guns if you don't like it. The communists...
So, any free press given an iota of coverage, contingent on clearing the red tape and rose-colored filtering necessary to ensure the topic always shows the good guys to be good and the bad guys to be very, very bad, and, of course, to make truthers appear to be conspiracy theorists, and conspiracy theorists are always these bad, crazy guys, according to the mainstream narrative. No thanks to Alex Jones, of course. Now, one thing I'll point out really quick is that a lot of truthers show that an overwhelming, high, extremely unproportionate number of high-level Hollywood elitists are of Jewish descent. Now, I'm not going to deny the validity of this, nor am I going to defend either side of this argument. To me, Hollywood has always been an evil, deceptive matrix of occultism, indoctrination into witchcraft, and the incremental desensitization device targeted towards our children. And I'm fully aware that the people running Hollywood are not your average Joe next-door neighbor. In fact, I can guarantee you that 99% of all people to ever watch this video here will not be neighbors with any high-profile celebrities. It's just probably never going to happen, maybe one time out of 10,000. But there's always a chance, but high-profile celebrities typically live like Tony Montana.
You want to fuck with me? Okay.
But to get back on point, let's say, hypothetically, that you and, say, 10 other people run the CIA. You have been providing the funding and legal framework to ensure that 6 loyal companies, Disney Co., Time Warner, Viacom, etc., are all allowed to have a complete monopoly on all mainstream media.
Who are you really shopping for this holiday season? It's okay, you can admit it, if you've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
Well, it's okay, you can admit it if you have bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. You've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it, Todd. if you've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you brought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or 4, maybe even 10 items for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought maybe an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
Is it okay? You can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 3 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you brought an item or 2 or 10 for you.
It's okay, you can admit it.
If you've bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10. Say for yourself.
It's okay, admit it. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought yourself 1 or 2 or 10 things for yourself, because a lot of people do it.
So let's say that you and 10 other people who run the CIA and have been funding and enabling the 6 main media conglomerates to run a monopoly on information, while the illusion of choice or even opposing options of outlets, when in fact Fox, MSNBC, CNN, and yes, even RT are indeed run by the same group of people, which is all cleverly hidden via proxy groups, sister companies, clever major shareholdings in each company. There's lots of ways that a small group of people who just so happen to have unlimited funding, who also could just so happen to run the CIA, could have so much control over what is aired over mainstream waves, and nobody could ever trace their involvement back as the ultimate source and controlling entity in what we call news and media. Now, assume for a moment that this scenario is true. We're just testing a hypothesis here, and let's just say that these 10 people are of all different backgrounds except one. Let's say they're all every race but Jewish. George Bush Sr., nor his father, who created the CIA, nor any other CIA director have ever been Jewish. That's right, not one single Jewish person has ever directed the CIA. So the possibility of my theory that we're testing becomes slightly more plausible with this information in light. Now, let's just say this group of people really hate the Jews, and it's no secret that Prescott Bush, W's grandfather, was caught red-handed dealing with the Nazis during wartime and was even indicted under the Trading with the Enemy Act, but that's a story for another day. The point is if you're a clever group of conspirators with unlimited funding and control over all major media outlets, and you really hate Jews, can you think of a reason for this group to strategically ensure that Jewish people get placed into high-profile Hollywood positions in such a conspicuous manner that it leaves one pondering? If the Jewish people are such clever deceivers, isn't it sort of stupid of them to make it so obvious that they're in control of Hollywood? Don't you think if they were as smart as we are saying that they are, and as craftily, wily as they're saying they are, they'd create, or you'd think they'd create, an unwitting group of goyim around them to play puppet and be the public face of the media outlet? Now, again, I'm not saying that this is what's going on. It's really just a hypothesis because Jewish people catch a lot of flack for running Hollywood, which is very much true. I mean, there's a lot of validity to that claim. On the other hand, we know there is a hidden hand behind all puppets, and the hidden hand prefers to remain, well, hidden. I realize there's a ton of despicable stuff written in the ancient Talmud. However, this fringe set of books remains mostly unknown to the majority of Jewish people most rabbis are mere novices in terms of the Talmud, and in fact, there appears to be a secretive group of pro-Talmud fringe rabbis who are involved with infiltrating groups such as the Masons and, yes, even Hollywood or possibly even the CIA. My whole point is that without the backing of the CIA, people like Disney or even George Lucas, ever seen THX? Ugh, it's brutally boring, and I'm surprised that the director of that movie was ever able to make Star Wars. However, when you realize that the director, being George Lucas, may have gotten help from the CIA and their so-called shoestring budget that Lucas loves to brag about when discussing the Death Star scenes, may not have been that shoestring after all. It's highly possible that Lucas, much like Kubrick, was given funding from certain covert government agencies with alphabet names under the condition that any advances achieved in creating realistic space scenes would later be used to fake space missions, and the deal with the devil would be easily made, especially with directors who were aspiring to become rich and famous. The point to this entire sidetrack was not to apologize for Jewish domination of Hollywood, just to offer a rational explanation of how, while Jewish people certainly do appear to dominate Hollywood, there's almost certainly a hidden hand behind the public figures who ostensibly don't like Jewish people very much and would much rather have the world angry with the Jews for running Hollywood than angry with the CIA backers for faking space and propping up infiltrated agents to fulfill an agenda that involves molding the consensus of the masses to more easily acquiesce to the pre-planned agenda, which is incrementally pre-programmed into our psyche as something we really want to achieve, even if the end result is catastrophic to the individual when played through to the end. Right, so with that out of the way, the next thing we're going to look at is the same, quote, stratosphere, quote, quadratids, quote, Iberian Peninsula video under a variety of combination of variables, including inverting the colors or creating negatives of the image, modulating variables such as color balance, saturation, etc., ultimately to see if we can find any hidden color information in the video footage. Now, I'll go ahead and point out that while I was originally led to believe by whom I believed was the original poster of the balloon footage that the primary bright object was the sun, I also did a few things on my end to verify that it could have been the sun. It seemed okay to me. After releasing the video, though, I was told by a friend that the background stars in that video were consistent with that of the moon, according to Stellarium, suggesting that the primary object in the video was actually the moon, not the sun. Now, I was a bit perplexed at this point and tried to verify the astronomical data using Stellarium as well. However, I was using the wrong dates, so my tests in that regard were irrelevant. Just is another reason why it's so important to include date-time information as well as directional frame of reference, altimeter, Latin longitude, etc. If you're going to launch a weather balloon, so that anyone analyzing the footage doesn't have to spend hours or even days figuring out where or when you launch the balloon, or which direction is which, or what time is it, leaving room for error and creating unnecessary work for the community. Now, I realize it sounds like I'm griping, but I am. Please, if you send up a weather balloon, include some reference data so that we can be sure about certain variables that affect the situation tremendously. Now, as I watched through the unedited video multiple times, I did realize that the original poster cut around a bit to replay certain sequences. So again, we know for sure that the video from start to finish is not in a perfectly linear fashion, or is not laid out in a perfectly linear fashion. So we cannot assume that the events we're witnessing during the course of the video are actually displayed in the order which they actually occurred. Now, again, a timestamp overlaid in the video would be like a never-ending fountain of chocolate to the person analyzing this balloon footage, just saying. Anyways, and that is if you like chocolate. Let's just say you don't like chocolate, then it would be a never-ending fountain of white chocolate or caramel or apple juice or whatever. Anyways, during multiple playbacks, I was about to say during multiple Apple Jacks for some reason. During multiple playbacks, I found several very strange instances where, under certain gamma corrections, it appears as if an object very similar to what the moon would look like passes or appears to pass in front of the primary object in the video. Now, without making the claim that the primary object is indeed the sun, and there's actually a secondary object which is being lit from the opposite side, therefore invisible to the camera since the moon appears to be reflective of sunlight and only of sunlight, seriously, why don't we see reflections of stars on the moon during a no moon or new moon phase? You'd expect to see at least one single reflection of a starlight off the moon at some point in history ever. However, I'm not aware of this ever occurring. Unless, of course, the documentation of stars being visible through the dark side of the moon could have been a situation involving a reflected starlight, or even an electromagnetic lensing effect of the light from the star bending around the moon and appearing where it technically should not appear. This would be similar to the idea of gravitational lensing. However, gravitational lensing is a theoretical impossibility, since gravity is a theoretical fantasy which has never been observed, proven, or demonstrated. However, the lensing witnessed during an eclipse, as predicted by Einstein to, quote, prove gravity as a space-time bending, could just as easily be caused by an electromagnetic field, the only difference being electromagnetic fields actually exist, and gravitational fields are exactly as authentic as my favorite armor in Dark Souls. It's a video game. Based on observation of the moon from the ground level and from 30,000 feet, a luxury certainly not afforded to the likes of Newton, we get a completely different picture of the moon. The moon appears to be much smaller and far more dim than it typically does from the ground. During the Night of the Quadratids, supposedly 1/3/2016 or January 3rd, 2016, when the camera points towards the primary object, a blinding large light is certainly the primary object of the sequence. I tried for many hours to find the moon in this footage, but I could not find the moon anywhere prior to uploading the video for the first time. When I was told the primary object was the moon, my first reaction was, get the fuck out of here, because not only was that the brightest moon I had ever seen, but on that night of 1/3 or January 3rd, 2016, it should have been a very obvious half moon. There are a few frames where the primary object appears to have a terminating line suggesting a nearly full moon phase, which is well out of line with what we should have seen in a heliocentric system if that primary object was indeed the moon. The moonlight, especially from 30,000 feet, should have been extremely faint and very obviously a half moon. This left me scratching my head because although the background stars were consistent with that of the moon from the perspective of the balloon, we could have been seeing the sun behind the moon, meaning the background stars would have been consistent with the moon. Now, when discussing this with the panel on Static Plain Truth on the Morgile 2, Saturdays at 3 Eastern, live, Dave Weiss mentioned this exact thought that I had and even had a diagram ready to explain what he was talking about. Matrix Reload and Event Skeptic brought up very viable arguments. However, I believe their arguments would only be viable from a ground-based position. It is my contention that when you gain 30,000 feet above the plane, your field of view increases. So we can no longer use programs like Stellarium to accurately predict what is going to occur from a completely different perspective, especially in a flat Earth geostationary model where the stars are not very distant. Now, in a heliocentric model, 30,000 feet in altitude wouldn't make that much of a difference in terms of perspective change or parallax change. However, in a flat Earth model where the celestial bodies are not nearly as distant, and it seems that visible light is not exactly the best standard upon which to base all of our theoretical models of the world. So, assuming the sun is about 3,000 miles up, according to the very same trigonometry which places the sun 93 million miles away when calculating the same numbers using spherical trigonometry instead of plane trigonometry, but assuming plane trigonometry and assuming the sun to be about 3,000 miles up, which is mathematically accurate according to plane trigonometry, meaning that you're assuming that the Earth is a plane instead of a sphere. So assuming the sun to be 3,000 miles up or so, 3 to 4,000, there's also this unknown factor of how light behaves when passing through different layers of electromagnetic fields, ionized plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere, varying densities of atmosphere, and finally reaching the convex lens of our eye. Studying the mysterious lights in the sky is certainly a lot of fun and very interesting, but it's a fairly large leap to call such an exercise in theoretical folly science. Merging away from this video for just a moment, I was walking my dog the other day, and I just so happened to notice what looked like leftover bits of a droid, like R2-D2 after a battle over Endor or whatever. I wish I would have kept the housing within I found this convex lens, but I just unscrewed it from the housing and got rid of the junk. My best guess would be this was part of a drone one of my neighbors was flying, because this certainly appears to be a convex lens capable of telescopic zooming, and the material which housed it was strong, flexible, and very lightweight. Now, I could be way off on this, but let's just say a convex lens fell from the sky and I literally stepped on the device housing and lens on my way home from the store with Boo Boo, my dog. Anyway, I don't think it was merely a coincidence that this convex lens fell almost directly into my lap during the exact same time that I'm scrutinizing this very bizarre footage of the moon, which appears to be the sun from the stratosphere, and was explained to me as being the sun by the original uploader, or whom I thought was the original uploader. So, with that being said, based on the research and the experimentation I've done since coming out with the Freak Sunrise video with the B.O.B. flatline as the audio track, I've come to the conclusion that while the primary object may be the moon, I have some doubts about that. I believe it's completely possible that we are indeed looking at the sun from about 30,000 feet in altitude, when the sun itself should be completely invisible according to the heliocentric model due to the spinning and spherical nature of the Earth. Now, if we're testing the heliocentric model, this video makes no sense either way, because if the primary object is the moon, it's the brightest moon I've ever seen, and it's nearly a full moon when it's supposed to be a half moon, and usually video footage of the moon from well above, 20,000 feet, it typically appears a lot less bright and a lot smaller than it does from the ground. Now, again, I think that due to our gain in altitude and the very nearby sun and moon, the perspective change or parallax shift in the background stars caused by gaining such altitude will completely misalign expected stellarium data by many, many degrees. I'm also considering the fact that if you've seen the eclipse from a plane video, where several orbs appear to be surrounding the sun, completely invisible until the totality of the eclipse, and only from the vantage point of the airplane. Remember, as we gain altitude, objects beneath the horizon will begin to apparently raise. This is the exact same principle that causes the horizon to raise with the observer in a hot air balloon or an airline flight. We humans were designed to be very intelligent and well coordinated at short distances around ourselves. A large, towering building nearby will not seem nearly as threatening or powerful or foreboding when viewed from 20 miles away. In other words, the more distant an object gains from us, the less and less relevant that object becomes to our immediate well-being or our personal safety. This is why I find it extremely difficult to swallow the claim of modern science that purports we can see Jupiter with the naked eye, a ball of gas at least 365 million miles away, according to them, which must be directly behind 90 million miles of asteroids. Yes, we can supposedly see Jupiter with the naked eye for at least 365 million miles away, 90 million of those miles being filled with mostly undocumented so-called asteroids, orbiting lumps of rock and giant rubble piles ranging in size up to miles in diameter. But our little eyes, our little convex lenses, easily spot an object 365 million miles away with 93 million miles full of junk in the way. No problem. Again, all of this is theoretical nonsense, but how is it possible for us to see a, quote, planet such as Jupiter so far off into the distance with the naked eye, yet we've never found a shred of viable evidence to physically support the theory of gravity, even with decades of modern science dedicated to the study? Why is it that we can demonstrate and prove electromagnetic fields every day, any old day of the week, yet the, quote, grandfathers of physics were completely ignorant of this phenomenon? I think this is a very important point that is often overlooked by modern science. The main point here is that our fundamental ideas about the world, the sun, the moon, stars, and ultimately the universe are extremely misinformed, if not the exact opposite of what the truth is. Now, I'll mention quickly that the phrase universe is the etymological equivalent to from many come one, or e pluribus unum. This is often portrayed near an unfinished pyramid on our money supply, near the Latin word for our crowning achievement, as well as a new world order, or a new order of the ages. So, what do these three ideas often found on American money have in common? Well, a new world order, a new view of the universe, or e pluribus unum, and our crowning achievement, annuit septis. Now, could it be that hidden people in power behind the monetary scam known as the Federal Reserve, which is exactly as federal as McDonald's and the kitty cat porn ranch in Nevada, but the Federal Reserve and the psychological scam behind the mass media and the scientific scam behind the propping up and funding people like Newton, Cavendish, Thomas Edison, Einstein, while discrediting and essentially erasing from history the greatest minds of, all time, such as Nikola Tesla, and then covering up the bona fide scientific evidence which shows that the Earth is a stationary plane and only the starlight or the ether is moving overhead. And a couple of examples would be the Michelson-Morley, Michelson-Gale experiments, Airy's failure, the Sagnac experiment. There were lots of experiments done involving light, which proved conclusively that the Earth is stationary and that it is only the starlight or the ether that is spinning, and yet these scientific experiments are actually omitted from all textbooks. So you'll never learn that if you want to become a theoretical physicist or any sort of, astronomer or physicist in general. You're never going to hear about any of those experiments. You're never going to hear contrary evidence to the heliocentric lies. It's always covered up. It's always ridiculed. And the people who, purport other models than the heliocentric model, like, people who say the Earth is a stationary plane, are always ridiculed and discredited. For example, the author of Zetetic Astronomy, Dr. Robotham, after his death, there was a huge smear campaign against him, which never ever attacks the evidence or the proof documented in his book. They just, basically slander him and try to discredit him and try to get people to think that he is a poor source of information, when in fact he is merely an observer sharing his observations with us and ultimately proving the world to be a plane as opposed to a spinning sphere, but I digress. Now, if you control all the wealth of the world and you control the mass media of the world, by extension, you control the minds of all people of the world who participate in the game of life, akin to Plato's Wall, where a group of people are raised in a cave, chained to the floor so that they can only face in one direction. Now, behind them, fires are lit, and the flashes and shadows on the wall in front of Plato's victims would eventually begin to represent their very own personal universe, complete with an entertainment output device, the flickers and shadows on the wall, and certainly would develop a series of creative stories and even lore amounting to volumes of myths describing the birth of the light and the material which makes up the darker parts of the wall at times. Surely, after many years, the victims of Plato's Wall would become experts at interpreting the lights and shadows on the wall to a degree which they could potentially develop entire religions, or at least habits based on cycles found in the otherwise random or chaotic highlights and shadows on the wall. After all these years, these poor people would absolutely view the random flickers and shadows on the wall as reality, and would scoff at anyone who told them that the lights on the walls were merely projections of light from a fire beneath them, and they would certainly defend their belief system crafted around the lore of the dancing fire on Plato's prison. Now, assuming you let one of the prisoners free to exit the cave, unbound his shackles, freed him of his chains, surely he would be hesitant to leave his familiar surroundings, but would eventually make his way out of the cave, past the fire which had previously generated his entire impression of reality since he was a child, upon seeing unfamiliar shades of colors like green, blue, brown, and all sorts of bright light that would be unfamiliar to such a prisoner. Curiosity would overcome fear of the unknown, and the man, who had spent his whole life deciphering shadows on a wall to construct his understanding of reality, is instantly faced with an entire world full of previously unimaginable sights and sounds and feelings, and certainly an emotional experience for that man. Now, when it came time for him to return to his permanent chains in the confines of Plato's cave prison, with the sparks and shadows dictating the current events, I suspect that he would not want to return. What do you think? Furthermore, upon being placed back into the group of those who never left the cave, could he ever possibly describe what he had seen, heard, and experienced? Could he describe a bird or a breeze? Would they believe him? Even if he was the most gifted literary genius, the best orator ever, it's doubtless that he would never convey the experiences adequately to his comrades, and they would indeed reckon him a madman before taking anything he stated to be serious. I'm sure they would say something along the lines of, "Well, there are no blue skies on the wall here, so you're obviously mad to think there could be blue skies on the other side of the wall." I'm sure they would insult him and provide very convincing reasons in terms of their group and in terms of their myths and lore as to why there were certainly no such thing as mountains or objects such as suns or moons. Birds and wildlife are obviously ridiculous according to Plato's prisoners, because such things could never exist on the wall of everything that is, was, and ever shall be. So I've sort of gotten off on a tangent, but it's an important point to remember that we people are extremely intelligent and by nature very trusting of authority. We were all raised since infants by people who knew much more than we did, and in fact taught us everything we know. Any questions we might have had are answered in great detail by many intelligent specialists, essentially rendering personal experimentation or verifying the results useless on the modern version of Plato's prison wall, known as the status quo or the mainstream narrative especially. At the end of the day, each of us have a choice whether to remain imprisoned in the New World version of Plato's prison cave, or merely decide to dissolve the chains holding us mentally bound to the Copernican principle, or the childish love for everything space, including Star Wars, Star Trek, Lost in Space, NASA, and let's not forget the Orwellian space race between Russia and the US, the entire Cold War was a cover for NASA and RASA to play Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant, spreading all the necessary propaganda to convince the entire world that America and Russia somehow had the ability to launch astronauts into the sci-fi pre-programmed idea of orbit and space travel, all based on the original hypothetical postulations of Newton and the conflicting postulations of Einstein, all of which led to this self-perpetuating false dichotomy which convinced the American public that the Russians were spying on us from space via the Sputnik rocket, which in turn gave the Americans, let's call them Hulk Hogan, the second wind needed to send several missions to the moon, an accomplishment that has never been done since by NASA, although the astronauts who supposedly flew the missions admit they have no understanding of physics or the missions they were supposedly the only experts on. For an astronaut from the Apollo missions to be pressed by Bart Sibrel in Astronauts Gone Wild and state, quote, "I'm not sure whether we passed through the so-called Van Allen belts on the way to the moon," end quote. This proves that one of the very few people in history to have traveled beyond the so-called low Earth orbit, or above about 300 miles in altitude, had absolutely no idea about the topic of, quote, space, and he apparently did not experience specific phenomenon which should have occurred during his 25,000-mile trek through the so-called Van Allen belts, which he absolutely would have traveled through on his way to the moon had he gone to the moon. Anyways, the point is, the world at large was primed and ready for space travel and moon landings, thanks to the mass media device, the federal education system, and the Orwellian relationship between Russia and the US during the Cold War. It certainly makes the truth all the more juicy. Furthermore, when America decided to suck up German scientists and technology after World War II, just as the Russians did, it's obvious that America was deeply allied with the Nazis during World War II, leading up to the point where Pearl Harbor was bombed, allegedly by the Japanese, who had no motive to do so, and in fact had the opposite of a motive to do so, as they were in the midst of negotiating peace deals when they suddenly, unexpectedly, unprovokedly attacked Pearl Harbor, which accomplished the worst possible thing that could have possibly happened to the Japanese people. Now, instead of a peace deal with the Americans, they now had a mortal enemy who was, up to that point, not even involved in the war in any real sense, but after Pearl Harbor, led the attack against Hitler and the Japanese. Now, I've brought this up before, but it's far more likely that the so-called Japanese planes, which attacked the unusually empty and quiet Pearl Harbor that day, were not Japanese planes at all, but were instead Eastern Russian Mongolians with planes dressed to look like Japanese planes in order to, quote, awaken the sleeping giant, end quote, that would ultimately decimate two of Japan's most important cities using what were obviously firebomb tactics similar to that used on Berlin. However, it appears the propaganda of nuclear weapons was used to prove to the world that the US had created the nuke before anyone else could achieve it, giving the US a sort of permanent ace up its sleeve in terms of world politics. Now, it's no surprise that the Russians soon gained nuclear capabilities, because what good is a dichotomy where you only have one protagonist instead of two protagonists/antagonists to pit against one another? Russia had to also develop nuclear technology, which does not exist, by the way. Nuclear bombs are indeed a hoax. However, the Orwellian concept of MAD, or mutually assured destruction, is the perfect tool for the few elites who would like to control us. What better way to give themselves perceived power over the masses, who indeed hold the real power, But the thought that two nations had the ability to completely annihilate one another without a single shot being fired, without a single word spoken, no diplomacy prior to an honorable battle, just this false idea that a couple heads of state could decide to destroy the world, or even Matthew Broderick could decide, and the entire world could be destroyed with the push of a few codes and then a turn of a couple of keys simultaneously. Now, I'm not denying that nuclear programs existed. My grandfather was actually involved at a very high level with engineering specific elements of the Minuteman missile silos. Those are those thousands of nuclear missile housings found scattered across the deserts, buried deep underground, which go many stories underground, in fact, some of which, some of the retired ones, are being converted into prepper shelters for the super rich, where a single level of one of these, missile silos costs some unobtainable amount of cash for the average person. It's like $50 million or something ridiculous. But the point is, I don't doubt that my grandfather helped engineer the Minuteman missile silos, and I totally understand they were built because he helped build them. He was an engineer on site. And as a matter of fact, he oversaw the construction of many sites. So these things were built. These missile silos were indeed built. So there was a program. I also believe they inserted large so-called ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, within these housings. I also believe there were a handful of physicists who believed they had the technology to manually split a theoretical atom by simultaneously firing opposing blasting caps in towards a tube of enriched uranium or plutonium, with the timing being so precise, necessarily so precise, that they could not be off by a single fraction of a millisecond from one side to the other, or the so-called atomic detonation would fail. Of course, they got it right the first time, no problem, but furthermore, when they allegedly set off the first atomic bomb, they were unsure whether the chain reaction of splitting an atom would have a finite effect area, or if the chain reaction would propagate exponentially, thus destroying the entire planet in a matter of a few seconds. This is the official narrative, of course. However, when you realize the tests you've seen of nuclear bombs are either A, 1,000 tons of dynamite, or B, scale model explosions, the first case is the most believable in terms of, viewing the footage of it. It looks real because technically you're looking at a 1 megaton or 1 kiloton, quote, explosion, but it's important to understand the definition of magnitude in terms of nuclear explosions. A kiloton explosion literally means a force roughly the equivalent to 1,000 tons of dynamite. So there are some extremely realistic videos you can find online of military tests of soldiers in a foxhole, presumably about 20 to 50 miles away from a 1 kiloton nuke, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll try to find that clip and roll it here. Now, for argument's sake, that video certainly appears to be real. However, it absolutely does not prove a nuclear explosion occurred. In fact, if you consider the fact that the military has what is known as infinite ammo as well as infinite funds, this would certainly include dynamite as infinite ammo and other types of explosives as well. It's entirely possible that the real shots of nuclear blasts under controlled U.S. conditions were exactly propaganda and were not evidence of nuclear technology, but instead evidence of the United States' possession of infinite ammo, which includes 1,000 tons of dynamite for sure. Now, the other footage of nuclear tests that you'll find are so very obviously scale models, it's laughable that anyone was ever fooled by such poorly done fakes for any duration whatsoever. Some of these nuke tests look exactly like a toy train set I had when I was about 7, so just saying on that. Now, I'm not trying to take away from the tragedy that happened to the Japanese during World War II. However, what I am saying is those two cities, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, were not nuked. They were firebombed, carpet bombed day after day, week after week, just like Berlin, Germany was. And if you look at the aftermath pictures of Berlin versus the aftermath pictures of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, you'll notice that they look pretty much the same. And in fact, there is no evidence that a nuclear bomb went off ever. Okay? And people like Mark Sargent and others will point to the so-called Operation Fishbowl, where the U.S. military claims to have launched nukes up towards the sky, and what you get is a cartoon that looks like, I don't know, like a cracked windshield in slow motion. But I tend not to believe cartoons from the military. And by the way, if you shoot a nuclear bomb up into space, let's just say space is an infinite vacuum, there's not going to be many atoms to split, so it would be sort of folly to launch a nuclear bomb up into space if we lived in a heliocentric model. However, if they launched nukes up to the firmament as a glass dome that cracked, well, that wouldn't make much sense either. But my position on this is nukes don't exist, and there's good evidence for that, and the firmament is not a glass dome in the sky. So the whole, Operation Fishbowl cartoon was nothing more than propaganda, and I'm sorry to say, you can watch that again, and maybe I'll try to include a clip of it in this video, but it is not convincing evidence to me whatsoever of nuclear bombs hitting the dome in the sky. The point to all of this is to show that it's 100% possible that Russia and the US, the KGB and the CIA angst ever depicted in cinema, heightening the fear and respect for covert, black budget, unconstitutional government agencies who are by definition enemies of the people because they spy on us illegally, operate beyond the realm of legalities, operate beyond the guidance or agreement of our so-called elected officials, whom I would rather call selected sheep-officials, and have permanent, now the CIA have permanent immunity to any sort of political pressure, as long as they can pull the matter of national security card, which happens to be forever, as in never-ending. In other words, no matter what happens, the government can refuse to report to the American people, the government's masters. Yes, they are our servants and the people are the masters, but they can refuse to report to us because some information may be detrimental to national security. Now, forgive me if I'm missing something here, but if an issue is so important that it's of national security concerns, doesn't that mean it should be broadcast to and discussed by the people within the nation? I mean, we are the national people, and it's our security that's in question, so I'm really having a hard time understanding how matters of national security should be kept secret from the nation. Maybe they should just say it's a matter of covering our asses so we don't get lined up against a wall and shot, in terms of the CIA doing things like, I don't know, Operation Fast and Furious, or even the Apollo missions, but I digress. I never understood how government officials can hide behind matters of national security, since we all know that secrets which could potentially hurt us or threaten our national security are obviously going to be most effectively dealt with if all people are aware of the issue and have the ability to discuss the problem, which is, of course, always going to be the federal government in terms of the problem. The federal government is the problem, and covert programs claiming to keep us safe and keeping secrets for matters of national security in the first place are the problem. Now, with all these tangents aside, I'm fully aware that programs like Stellarium are going to accurately represent visible heavens from the perspective of an observer on the ground anywhere in the world. It's accurate. I'm also aware that this software assumes the world to be a globe and also assumes the stars to be infinitely distant, more or less, and so we cannot necessarily rely on programs such as Stellarium to determine how celestial bodies will align when viewed from the stratosphere, for example. there are too many abnormalities with this video to absolutely call this one way or the other. One thing I always try to do is tally up pros and cons for any dilemma. This usually will help to determine the probability of one scenario or hypothesis over the other. We'll look at the pros and cons of the primary object either being the sun or being the moon in this video. And I'm sure I didn't remember to do everything. Forgive me. And if anybody has any ideas to add to it, then make a video about it and give some more pros and cons about this video or this primary object in this video either being the sun or the moon. Now, the primary object being the sun, and again, the definition of the primary object is that big bright light that looks just like the sun. That's the primary object. The pros, or the evidence that supports that being the sun are: the primary object is bright and looks like the sun. It doesn't look like the moon at all. Furthermore, it doesn't appear to be a half moon whatsoever, which it should have been that night. Doesn't appear like any other high altitude balloon footage of the moon I've ever seen. A moon-like anomaly appears in the hidden color information of the footage in front of and around the primary object, astonishingly casting shadows uncannily aligned to the expected angles if the primary object is the sun further off in the distance than the moon, and so although higher appears to be lower than the moon when in fact the sun is higher yet more distant in this particular scenario, and the secondary or hidden object is indeed or could indeed be the moon. If we suppose the primary object is the moon, brilliantly lit to a nearly full state, then the sun should be somewhere behind us, although according to Stellarium and the conventional model, the sun is 93 million miles further away than the moon and obscured around approximately 5,000 miles of curvature if the Earth is a globe. Since the Earth is not a globe, then the sun would still be very distant, about 5,000 miles away, but certainly not 93 million miles behind the moon. Also, I will note that our atmosphere and these different layers of electromagnetic fields that I've been sort of describing throughout the duration of this video tend to play tricks on our eyes, and so just because we point to something and say there is that object in the sky doesn't necessarily mean that we're pointing at that object, because again, light does not behave in a perfectly rectilinear fashion always forever like we tend to think that it does. In either case, and this is the final pro for the primary object being the sun, in either case, sun or moon, this footage makes zero sense in the heliocentric model. Now we'll go to the primary object being the sun cons, or evidence that goes against the primary object being the sun. First point is, of course, the Stellarium data indicates the background stars are consistent with that of the moon. The second one would be the stars are visible, and I'll put a sort of asterisk by that because, and I'll just go ahead and explain it now. The only reason I even got this footage was because, again, I was chatting with this guy who said he had a lot of weather balloon footage, and I asked specifically, do you have anything with the sun and the stars visible in the same sky? And so he sent this to me. And so, again, the second con for this primary object being the sun is that the stars are indeed visible. And finally, the last thing I could come up with in favor of this primary object being the moon, no other object is visible in the sky in the visible spectrum other than the primary object, which appears where the moon should, according to Stellarium, but from the ground level only. Based on the original claim of the supposed original poster of the Iberian Peninsula during the Quadratins event in January of 2016, who told me the primary object in question was indeed the sun, visible over the horizon when it should be well behind the curve of the Earth, certainly seems like a plausible explanation, even with the aforementioned Stellarium data having the background stars in the frame in line with the expected stars traveling with the moon that night. If the stars are not actually billions of miles away, nor thousands of light years away, or even a single light year away, but instead are very local, as close as possibly a few thousand miles, or perhaps the stars could be something so far removed from physical objects bound to physical laws and forces that we're familiar with here on the ground on the physical plane. It's extremely naive to try and label, measure, and weigh the stars in our typical labors to understand every minute detail of a subject, even if that means filling in the unknown areas with theories, ideas, conjecture, extrapolations, and even lies, so long as they are propped up by the funded, the well-funded CIA-backed parrots known as theoretical physicists, such as Einstein, Cavendish, Foucault, etc. Let's not forget Thomas Edison. I believe that attempting to liken the sun, the moon, and the stars to anything on or near the earth is egotistical theoretical folly that could never possibly yield tangible results in a venture based on such theoretical premises. For all we know, the stars could be emitting an invisible source of light from fairly nearby, although they could possibly be extremely distant. Under certain situations, it matters not how distant the source of light might be, but what is most important is at what point does the invisible electromagnetic waves become diffused into visible light. And by diffused, I mean D-I-F-F-U-S-E-D, diffused. It means like when you see a rainbow, that's white light being diffused into the visible spectrum or into the rainbow spectrum. But anyway, light is such a subjective phenomenon. The more we try to understand it, the more questions are raised. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. Take a standard laser pointer. You can get them at the dollar store for $1. Now, say stand 30 feet away from the wall and point the laser at a wall at your house and set the thing down so that it's pointed at that wall 30 feet away. Now, without obstructing the beam of light, walk towards that wall, get as close to it as possible, get as close to the dot on your wall as possible, and just take some observations in terms of brightness, radius of the dot, etc. And now do the same exact experiment again, only placing the laser pointer 3 feet from the wall instead of 30. Now, get as close to the dot as you can and observe it. You'll probably notice some small differences in terms of radius of dot, brightness, but the laser point will more or less be very similar on your wall after traveling 3 feet or 30 feet, and that's just a tiny laser pointer. Now, from those two experiments, suppose you had no idea there was a laser pointer involved at all. Let's just say you were only aware of the dot on the wall itself. Now, when comparing the two sets of experiments from your ill-informed position, it would be impossible for you to determine what, where, or anything physically attributed to the source of light, which we all know was the laser pointer, but you in this, hypothetical experiment had no idea such a thing existed. As in both cases, the laser pointer was behind you and you were not aware of it, you would be able to, hypothesize all sorts of things about the source of that little dot on your wall. But I can pretty much guarantee you, without the knowledge of the laser pointer, you'd be, what's the best way to put it? You'd be digging a hole with a shovel made out of Jell-O. If you could apply a similar line of thought to the sun, moon, and stars, perhaps we can start to get a better understanding of what's actually going on. We can certainly use programs like Stellarium to an extent. However, we must remember that all, quote, scientific software dealing with the heavens are going to be coded around a heliocentric matrix, inherently carrying the assumption that the Earth is a globe and space is in all directions, with the stars being essentially infinitely distant suns or galaxies. Let's assume for a moment that the stars are relatively close by, say 5,000 miles up, just throwing a number out there. If the electromagnetic waves from those stars are traveling through the ether, invisible to our eye, but at the point where those electromagnetic waves penetrate our protective firmament, probably not made of glass, perhaps behaving like a lens or even a prism which diffuses the electromagnetic waves from the distant stars into the visible spectrum. Now, much like the laser pointer experiment, since we honestly have no idea what or where the source of light is coming from in terms of the stars and the sun or the moon, it's rather futile to try and use mathematics, no matter how brilliant or technically correct you think it is. The simple truth is, we humans are incapable of discerning pretty much everything in the heavens, and perhaps that is the way things are meant to be. When I was sent the video of the freak nighttime sunrise of the Iberian Peninsula from the stratosphere, of course I thought it was too good to be true, and for a few reasons. For one, the stars were visible, the very reason I begged the gentleman to send me a link in the first place. There was also no date time information, nor barometric pressure or altitude readings, and so without that basic information, it really creates a lot of unnecessary legwork and research and guesswork on the part of others trying to understand the exact variables involved with any balloon launch, and specifically this balloon launch. I hope that the original poster of that balloon launch will contact either myself or anyone else interested in learning more about the specific data mentioned in this video. Thank you so much for your contribution, although it appeared to be focused more on the quadratids than on the actual bizarre behavior of whatever the hell the primary object here is. Now, I'll leave this one an open case because I believe that more information and further observation is needed. There's certainly more than meets the eye going on here, and I would not be surprised if the primary object is indeed the sun, and the secondary object, only visible in the hidden color information of the video file, may be the moon, or could be something completely different, or it could be nothing. However, nothing doesn't usually show up as a spherical object casting shadows in the correct alignment according to the flat Earth model. Regardless of the primary object, it is yet another example of how the heliocentric model couldn't possibly produce the reality we experience, and can scrutinize scientifically, but only to a degree. It's important that we take the scientific method very seriously, and that especially includes discarding failed theorem. And if we're going to be specific, I'm talking about the heliocentric model. The conventional understanding of the Earth and the universe is so utterly and astonishingly incorrect, and actually preposterous. The only reason this massive lie has continued through the ages as it has is because the misunderstood universe has been forced on toddlers as a well-known thing, like the Statue of Liberty. The fact is, theoretical physics doesn't have any answers to any of the important questions. However, they have a never-ending pile of peculiar theories to account for all the problems in the heliocentric model, just as one example, gravity and dark matter. Scientists don't understand how solar systems and galaxies remain bound together because, according to their theory and according to the so-called laws of physics, the vacuum of space shouldn't provide the necessary centripetal force to counter the centrifugal force generated by a theoretical sphere traveling across the unnaturally curved fabric of space-time, if near enough to a host generator of gravity, for example, the sun to the earth or the earth to the moon. Both are examples of theoretical spheres which orbit other theoretical spheres due to the unproven, 100% debunked theory of gravity. The vacuum of space should not allow for these orbital relationships to continue, especially at the galactic level, with that frame of reference in mind. But the fabric of space-time, in other words, nothing, isn't sturdy enough, surprise, surprise, but the vacuum of space-time, nothing, isn't sturdy enough to permanently chain the moon to the Earth or permanently chain the Earth to the Sun, or permanently chain the Sun to the galactic center, allegorically speaking, of course. Technically, according to the mathematics involved in how reality operates, if the heliocentric / galactic model were correct, all of the galaxies should have disformed millions or billions of years ago. So we shouldn't be able to see many of the older galaxies, and we should also see galaxies markedly expanding or losing their structure in line with the law of entropy, by the way. Now, granted, each galaxy is supposedly moving independently of all the other galaxies and expanding away from one another, but the so-called stars and planets that make up a galaxy are somehow able to defy physics and the mathematical equations and remain steadfast, snugly held together galaxies, when in fact the known laws of gravity and the known laws of physics simply do not allow for this to occur, even in theory, which is why scientists are always left scratching their head, or scientists are baffled, or scientists find the axis of evil situation involving observations of distant galaxy clusters through 3 different wavelengths never produce results consistent with all 3 wavelengths in terms of the so-called weight of the galaxy clusters, quote, frightening. And yes, for some reason, hypothetical pants-on-fireists claim they can accurately weigh galaxies and galaxy clusters, even though they cannot accurately weigh the Earth, or even determine that the Earth isn't a globe, although they claim to have this ability using the so-called gravitational constant, an ancient dogma inserted into the doctrine of scientism by a royal astronomer named Sir Cavendish. Doesn't that have a nice ring to it? Now, Sir Cavendish carefully weighed out the Earth by hanging a few balls in his glorified tool shed, pompously claiming to have calculated the gravitational constant, or actually he claimed to have weighed the Earth. But essentially, weighing the Earth is something that he did scientifically in his glorified tool shed. Now, his findings couldn't have been incorrect, misguided, or overzealously interpreted because he actually ran telescopes from his tricked-out-ass tool shed away from the experiment area through the garden to his house so that he could observe the hanging balls without having his own gravitational fields interfering with the results of the experiment. Now, my first question to Cavendish would be, what about the gravity of the tool shed? Wouldn't that be far more rich in gravity than a measly man such as yourself? Furthermore, what about the gravity of the Earth, Mr. Royal Cavendish? Do you agree that the alleged ball would have some effect on the situation, assuming gravity is even involved? By the way, what about the gravity of the moon, sun, and galactic center, in that order? It's very clever of you, Mr. Cavendish, to use a typical sleight of hand misdirection tactic to convince the laymen of your time that you were the most
scientifical scientist that ever scienced.
And by creating a red herring element to the Cavendish experiment equation, it impressed upon the laymen of the time that Cavendish was a
careful, meticulous scientist who was so careful that he even ran telescopes into his tool shed to avoid his gravity interfering with the experiment.
But he also forgot to account for the gravity for the most gravitationally abundant objects nearby, according to the heliocentric model theory. Cavendish was an extremely questionable, if not partially, if not fully fictitious character. If you research his life and work, you'll find that he died among the top 5 richest men of his day. He was so terribly antisocial that he had special entrances to his home built so that his servants could come and go without having to interact with them, and even went so far as to build a variety of properties to ensure nobody was ever certain where he might be on a given day. It is reported, however, that strangely enough, Cavendish was an outshining member of the Royal Society Club who held him in very high regard and was certainly not acting in that capacity for any discernible philanthropic or charitable motives. As I mentioned before, it's possible that the quote person Cavendish never actually existed and was instead played in the game of life by a group of influential, scientifically capable minds and financiers of the time. One other peculiar thing I happened to notice about Cavendish is that as I was looking through different portraits of the man, it seems like there are many similarities between the portraits, but it's almost as if there were several different people posing as Cavendish. And I know this sounds sort of conspiracy theorist, but it sort of lends credence to this idea that I have that much like Shakespeare was propped up by this, sort of elitist secret society, which is very much true. In fact, the person William Shakespeare couldn't even write his own name, and most people who are experts on the subject believe that it was actually Francis Bacon, the same Francis Bacon who was involved with Freemasonry and I believe the Bavarian Illuminati along with Weishaupt, but I could be mistaken. And I just wonder if he's related to the rich and famous Kevin Bacon. Wouldn't that be funny? I wonder if he's related to bacon sandwiches. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, just thought that was interesting about Cavendish is that, try to find two portraits of him that look like they're of the same person. And mind you, when he died, he was the fifth richest man either in the world or in the country. So the dude was rich, like beyond beyond imagination rich. So he was certainly capable of, the personage, if he was actually a person, was certainly capable or had the finances to afford the best painters and portrait makers, whatever you call them. At any rate, just wanted to point that out, and I could be wrong here, but again, it seems like there are a couple different people that may have played Cavendish on the world stage prior to television. Pulling something like this off might actually have been a little bit easier. However, with today's technology, with CGI and that sort of thing, I don't know, it could go either way, but anyway, back to the regularly scheduled Flat Earth shenanigans. This would explain why Cavendish never entered into any interpersonal relationships and would always avoid contact with people outside the Royal Society Club. When you understand how these nefarious secret societies with plenty of money and insidious agendas, how they operate, it's not that far of a stretch to imagine a complete forgery of science in the form of Cavendish, whose work on the gravitational constant and other so-called groundbreaking physical discoveries were not uncovered until years after his death. Now, I believe this allowed the co-conspirators who took turns actually playing Cavendish during his lifetime, but it allowed these co-conspirators, and this is just a theory by the way, but it allowed them time to come out with certain facts or theories or experiments that were intended to be confirmed at a later date by the now defunct genius Cavendish. It makes perfect sense and would provide plausible deniability to any of the co-conspirators because if the thing was ever questioned or disproved, they could point to all of Cavendish's other work, which was correct, but also happened to be a collection of the Royal Astronomical Society's years of covert work and scheming. It turns out that Cavendish was about 1% off, according to modern physics, in terms of the gravitational constant. However, as truthers with brains and eyes, we know for certain that Cavendish and modern physics are so far beyond incorrect, we need to develop a new word to somehow describe the level of ignorance, stupidity, irony, vulgarity, hypocrisy, superstition, and blind, deaf, dumb faith in a religion that purports that you live on a tiny chunk of a giant, ancient, infinite explosion and somehow reside stuck to the side of a spinning sphere, flying around in outer space and infinite vacuum at velocities that are so ridiculous and beyond the scope of anything we could relate to or understand ever. It's really not worth mentioning the velocities they claim, but for scientific purposes, here on Earth, you are supposedly spinning 1,037.5 miles per hour eastward when near the equator. At the same time you're going eastward, you're also dropping vertically at about 700,000 feet per hour near the equator. Okay, so I wanted to do a little bit deeper dive into the least significant, slowest motion in our neighborhood, which would be the axial rotation. And slowest is a relative term because, of course, axial rotation, if you're standing at the equator, is supposedly 1,037.5 miles per hour, which is pretty darn fast. It's well beyond the speed of sound. However, if you were standing at the pole, then axial rotation would cause you to spin half the speed as the hour hand on a clock. Furthermore, the disparity between the 2 points, again being the equator and the so-called supposed theoretical axis of rotation, the disparity between these 2 points would be even greater because at the equator, not only are you traveling at a much faster velocity, essentially infinitely faster, but you're also standing perpendicular to the axis of rotation, and the radius of curvature is about 4,000 miles in the heliocentric globe Earth model. Now, conversely, at the North Pole, the radius of rotation would be 0. So again, the disparity between speed or velocity or acceleration due to spinning would be infinite at the equator and 0 at the pole, or rather infinitely stronger at the equator than it is at the pole, where the reading in terms of outward thrust or centrifugal force would be essentially 0. Again, because at the North Pole you're standing on top of the axis, parallel to the axis, and spinning half the speed as the hour hand on a 12-hour clock. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but at the equator you're supposedly traveling 1,037.5 miles per hour east. Now, there's a little bit more to this, and I'm just going to read from this little diagram that I spent a little bit of time on. But theoretical axial rotation can be imagined as a fixed frame of reference, but only if you consciously decide to abandon all logic, common sense, and physical experiments. Physics is literally the observation and study of objects in motion. The fact that so-called physicists are unable to realize the very plain, simple truth that the world is indeed 100% stationary, starting with theoretical axial rotation, but no such axial rotation exists in reality, but only in the minds and in the assumptions of all people who believe they understand physics, and that includes all physicists, unfortunately. Our majestic and astonishing, baffling beyond the comprehension of all the most learned humans throughout history combined, our world is just so mysterious and magnificent, but in our modern age, all secrets appear to be being revealed as promised by many ancient texts in terms of revelation. Now, the flat earth is a mathematical certainty. Again, the heliocentric model claims that at the equator, you're spinning while standing perpendicular to the axis at 1,037.5 miles per hour. Additionally, we must, at the equator, also be dropping vertically, racing around a curve at the theoretical equatorial velocities. So, with some minor calculations, and it's actually not that difficult of calculations, we can actually figure up how much vertical droppage should occur for a person really at any latitude, but we'll go with the equator for it would be the most dramatic. But it's relatively simple math if you understand the curvature calculations. And again, this is sort of a hip pocket calculation. It's not meant to be entirely accurate, although the conversion tools online do appear to give results right down to the umpteenth decimal point. But again, this is accurate enough, but I wouldn't say that it is accurate right down to these decimal points. But that amount of accuracy is irrelevant, because if the Earth was a sphere, you would definitely find evidence of curvature, and if it was a spinning sphere, you would definitely find evidence of spinning. So basically what we've done here is, in order to find the apparent vertical equatorial descent or acceleration due to axial rotation at the equator, and by acceleration, I don't mean the eastward 1,037.5 miles per hour. That is apparently a constant speed, and physicists will argue that you will maintain that angular momentum because you're moving with the Earth. You'll maintain that angular momentum, which does make sense in a Newtonian principle. All actions are caused by or all actions have an equal and opposite reaction, but also all objects in motion will tend to remain in motion until enacted upon by some other force. And so just by traveling in a straight line at exactly, 1,037.5 miles per hour, if that was in a straight line and never changing speed, that there would be no acceleration involved. And if you had no frame of reference, you would apparently feel like you were standing still. Like if there was no atmosphere, of course. If you were traveling through the wind or through the atmosphere at those speeds, you'd certainly notice the speed. But let's just say you were in a vacuum traveling that fast, then you couldn't tell whether you were moving or standing still, as long as you didn't have any sort of frame of reference to, gauge your speed by. So at any rate, what I've done is I wanted to calculate the apparent vertical equatorial descent and acceleration due to axial rotation. So the first thing I did is I figured up, at the equator, how far does a stationary observer travel along this alleged curve in a single hour? Well, that's very easy, since the Earth travels once every 24 hours. And the circumference of the Earth is roughly 25,000 miles. It comes out that at the equator, you are indeed traveling 1,037.5 miles per hour towards the east. So, in order to figure out how much curvature is going to be involved with that distance over 1 hour, because the amount of time is irrelevant, whether it took you 10 years to travel 1,037.5 miles, you would still traverse across the same amount of curvature as if you did it in an hour. So, the first thing to do is take the distance in miles and multiply it by itself, or square the distance in miles. And so 1,037.5 miles squared equals 1,076,426.25 miles squared. Now, we'll just call that m squared, which is again 1,076,406.25. And we're going to take that result and multiply it by 0.66666666. The more sixes you put, the more accurate the result, and by using this method, you will render the result in feet. Contrarily, you could have squared the distance in miles and divided it by 8 to render the result in inches, but then of course you would have to divide that by 12 to get it into feet. So it just sort of saves a step to multiply the square of the distance in miles by 0.66666 to infinity, which by the way results at 717,604.165949 feet of vertical drop over that distance, or over 1,037.5 miles. So 717,604 feet equates to 135.90987991453, and we'll just say 136 miles an hour. Now, 136 miles an hour doesn't sound that fast. I mean, many of us have driven in cars close to that speed, but when you're talking about vertical descent, a constant vertical descent around a curve upon which you are zipping around at 1,037.5 miles an hour, maintaining your angular momentum along the way may not be that difficult. However, you are also sort of falling down or descending along with the Earth along that curve at a rate of 136 miles an hour. Now, this is sort of a huge problem for gravity, because you know how they say gravity is so weak that it can't be detected or measured or documented, or really, you know, there's not even any reason to believe gravity exists because the Earth isn't a spinning globe of any sort. But they do say that gravity is very weak. It is the weakest of the natural forces, which are electromagnetism, gravity. There's a couple other ones. Oh, the nuclear force, of course, which is very much just theoretical. So, at any rate, just to sort of put this in another term, imagine if you're going down a roller coaster ride that's going perfectly straight at 1,000 miles an hour, and the roller coaster is going perfectly straight at 1,000 miles an hour. If you were really on a very smooth track, it may appear as if you were standing still, because you are going to maintain your angular momentum, or sort of ride along with that linear traveling car, that linear traveling roller coaster. However, if that roller coaster was dropping 135 miles an hour, which is extremely fast for a roller coaster ride, I really don't think many of them get to that fast ever, but I will do a little background research into roller coasters and see if that's even doable. But the whole point is first of all, you would certainly notice that sort of falling away, especially at the equator, but the force of gravity, which is so weak, would necessarily have to provide a counterbalance, or it would have to negate that tendency, or your body's inertia essentially wanting to be flung in a rectilinear path away from the center of the curving body at a rate of about 135 miles an hour. Again, that's because even if you're standing at the equator, perpendicular to the horizon, spinning eastward at a perfectly, straight line east, that's one thing, and you could potentially call that a fixed frame of reference as long as you're fixed to the ground. However, when you consider that that is actually supposedly a curved line, then the idea of angular momentum somehow applying itself to an inverse square parabolic curve is beyond lunacy. It's ridiculous. The objects attached to the Earth would certainly be, compelled along the eastwardly path due to being stuck to the Earth by gravity. However, I do not understand how gravity, being so weak, is able to keep us pinned to the Earth at the equator when we should be wanting to fly off at a tangent to the curve of the Earth at about 135 miles an hour. Thank goodness for gravity, because that's a great deal of downward pressure, essentially keeping us chained to the Earth. Now, the big problem I have here is one that I've mentioned just a moment ago with an observer at the North Pole. If an observer at the North Pole is conducting the same experiment as the person at the equator, traveling 1,037.5 miles in an hour. Now, again, this theoretical globe is not to scale, but we're looking at it from a top-down perspective, with this being the north and the A-B sort of right angle that you see is the 2 points that a person standing still at the equator would theoretically travel in an hour on the spinning spherical Earth. Now, if you can honestly say that gravity has the power to keep a person stuck to the face of the Earth who really wants to fly off the face of the Earth at 136 miles an hour, then shouldn't the person standing at the North Pole who is on top of the axis, parallel with the axis, and not spinning, shouldn't that person experience gravity far more violently than the person who has this outward thrust that gravity must necessarily negate or equalize in order to keep that person stuck to the face of the Earth? Now, if you're traveling 1,037.5 miles in 1 hour, that's 1,037.5 miles theoretically traversed by a stationary observer at the equator zipping around a giant curve eastward, according to the unfounded, preposterous dogmas of this ancient religion who purport their bizarre belief system as factual. The related theory of Earth's so-called axial rotation, with the center of curvature being theoretically aligned with the magnetic north, and Polaris, the North Star, with the center of curvature in terms of the parameters of the Earth, the theoretical axis of rotation, which has never been measured, supposedly 4,000 miles down from your feet at the equator towards the center of the theoretically spinning Earth. Standing at the equator, it takes an hour to travel from point A to point B. Spinning along at the equator, you should experience an outward acceleration of around or slightly above 130 miles an hour, simply due to the axial rotation alone. Now, gravity is supposedly the theoretical farce which provides the necessary centripetal force to negate such an overwhelming centrifugal force generated by the naturally, theoretically spinning sphere Earth. So hopefully this has helped you guys to understand a little bit better what I mean when I say that not only are we traveling, eastward around this curve at 1,037.5 miles an hour, but if you're standing at the equator in both of these examples, every hour you're actually essentially going down a roller coaster hill at 135 miles per hour. So really quickly, let me just Google search the fastest roller coaster. Well, it's very, very close indeed. The Formula Rossa, I'm hoping I'm saying that right, at Ferrari World, the top speed is reported at 149 miles an hour, which is just a hair, just barely faster than our supposed vertical descent due to axial rotation near the equator. So I'll throw up a pic at that roller coaster, but I can guarantee you that when the people going straight down the track, pretty much with, stuck to that roller coaster as a fixed frame of reference, when they hit that downhill where they're going, about 150 miles an hour, they're going to feel it. Just as an interesting side note, the second fastest roller coaster is the King de Ka at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey, which max speed is 128 miles per hour, which is slower than the vertical drop due to axial rotation at the equator. So that roller coaster is, slower than the constant dropping away we should experience every day, all day long, near the equator at over 130 miles an hour. If you're in the sort of middle of the United States, probably closer to 100 miles an hour, but I'm not going to do all the math on that. Just know that we're definitely not spinning, and we're definitely not falling around a curve at any miles an hour whatsoever. When they hit that downhill where they're going, about 150 miles an hour, they're going to feel it. They're going to be able to tell the difference. And, similarly, I've argued that not only do we have this spinning, and I'm just going to cover the spinning in this video because I'll cover the Earth's supposed traversing around the sun in later videos, as well as the sun's supposed traversing around the galactic center in other later videos, and ultimately the galaxies all flying off in different directions, galaxies which should be breaking apart or sort of falling apart due to issues with, space-time, not being a very good structural component. At any rate, I digress. I just thought that it was adequate enough to sort of describe these major problems just with axial rotation alone. And, of course, I've made several videos covering, problems with orbital mechanics as well as curvilinear orbits that are often in conflict being considered any sort of fixed frame of reference. So, for example, imagine that the galaxy or the galactic plane is traveling, just say for a frame of reference, let's just say it's traveling straight up. So here lately I have been a bit confounded in terms of the accepted version of the lie known as the universe. I've always had a fairly, firm understanding of the so-called scientific explanation of reality, but there's always been a few points of contention for me, so I've done a little bit further research into some things that I've been sort of curious about, wondering in terms of what exactly is going on with the galaxy and that relationship with the ecliptic or the solar plane, and that relationship with the moon's orbital plane around the Earth. And it's very peculiar indeed. One example of an issue that I have is all the different models and theories about what's going on with our solar system in relation to the galaxy. Now, it's my understanding that the Milky Way galaxy is supposedly a spiral galaxy, so essentially all the stars and bodies that orbit around the central mass of the galaxy, which is supposedly a supermassive black hole, all of this stuff is supposedly orbiting the center of the galaxy on essentially the same plane. And so that's why it's sort of dubbed a spiral galaxy, because the everything sort of goes in spirals around a central sort of disk area. And I've always sort of thought that the solar plane, or the ecliptic, the plane upon which our planet and most of the other planets allegedly orbit around the sun, that's called the ecliptic, or you can call it the solar plane. I always thought that that was in a line with the galactic plane. It sort of makes a lot of sense that it would if the Milky Way galaxy is indeed, this spiral galaxy where everything's going around in concentric circles around the center. But that obviously didn't work with observations, so they had to sort of change things up a little bit, which is where you get this very bizarre and cartoonish looking diagram I have here, admitted. But this is actually a fairly accurate representation of the heliocentric model. So a couple of things to point out, and I guess I'll start with the largest objects and work my way down. So the largest object in this system here is obviously the galaxy, which is the big brown ellipse sort of in the dead center with the big black hole in the middle, and you can see it's sort of got spiral arms that appear to be going around the central point of the galaxy. Now, I've gotten a few different explanations of what's going on here, but one source of information says that the stars in these arms of the galaxy are going around the center at about 515,000 miles per hour. The sun allegedly travels around its orbit through the galaxy at around 483,000 miles per hour on average. So those two numbers aren't that far off. The issue that I have is that the solar plane, or the ecliptic, is supposedly at a 60-degree angle to the galactic plane. So again, I was sort of under the impression that the solar system was on a similar plane, or essentially on the same plane as most of the other solar systems in the Milky Way galaxy, since it is a spiral galaxy. But no, our solar system is angled at 60 degrees towards the galactic plane. And this is, of course, all theoretical. Now, the first thing, or the next thing that I'll point out is that you'll notice that the Milky Way galaxy depicted here is essentially a plane, because again, that is what it supposedly is. And all of the stuff that's spiraling around the center, or most of the stuff that's spiraling around the center, except for our solar system, of course, but all that stuff is moving in conjunction with the center of the galaxy at some wild velocity. I've heard anything from 1.3 million miles an hour up to 3 million, up to much faster than that. But just for the sake of this diagram, we'll say that the galaxy itself, so all of the stuff in our galaxy, is all traveling at a fixed frame of reference in a possibly straight line, but more than likely a curved line. This is all theoretical, of course, but at 1.3 million miles an hour, zipping through space in the opposite direction as all other galaxies. Remember, all galaxies are supposedly traveling away from each other at mind-boggling speeds because they all are resultant or caused by the Big Bang, which is a theoretical explosion that actually never happened. But sort of getting sidetracked, it's just an important point to remember that the galaxy upon which everything spins around here in our little local neighborhood in the Milky Way galaxy is not a stationary environment, but instead everything is traveling with it at 1.3 million miles an hour. And so you can basically call that speed, or that velocity through space, anywhere within the Milky Way galaxy, you can call that 0 miles per hour, because relative to everything else around you, everything's traveling at that exact same speed, even though everything is not traveling at that exact same speed. that's what they tell you that everything is doing. So since it all is traveling at the same speed, then everything appears to be traveling at zero. That's the theory. Okay, now the next thing that we're going to move out to, because we've described the Milky Way galaxy as a plane, and that's sort of the horizontal plane in this diagram. You can see that I've depicted the outer edge of the spiral arms, the stars towards the outer edge, spinning around the galactic center at about 515,000 miles per hour, with our sun traveling at an odd, peculiar 60-degree angle to the galactic plane at 483,000 miles per hour, allegedly. And then when you move up from the sun, you can see where the Earth's supposed orbit intersects with that of the sun. And I just sort of placed a little green area where you see those two orbital ellipses intersect. So you can see the yellow orbital ellipsis of the sun, which traverses at a 60-degree angle through the galactic plane. And then you can see above that the blue elliptical orbit of the Earth. And where those two intersect, I just put that as green, just to sort of show that these two orbital paths are on the same plane, which they allegedly are. It's called the ecliptic, or you can call it the solar plane, but it's just the essentially the plane around which the Earth and all the other planets, except for one in our solar system, allegedly revolve around. So it's almost like they're, just balls spinning around on a flat table, more or less. I believe that one of the planets is supposedly orbiting our solar system at a angle that is, divergent from the ecliptic. Anyway, as we look at the Earth's orbit around the Sun, we notice that it's going 66,600 miles per hour on average, and it takes a year to make one circuit. By the way, the Sun is supposedly traveling at 483,000 miles per hour. It takes 250 million years to make one circuit around and through and below and back to where it started through the galaxy. So there are some problems here which I've sort of described in videos where I've animated third generation satellite bodies, but the facts presented here are going to make animating this much more difficult, although much more fun and rewarding, and I do plan to animate this, whether that's in a two-dimensional or three-dimensional sort of way is yet to be decided. I'm still trying to brush up my 3D Studio Max skills enough to where I can do something like that. However, I think I can achieve something, good enough for government work to show how these sort of orbital patterns are impossible in a heliocentric model, and I'll sort of try to explain why. And I'll try to roll one of my videos showing that bodies in orbit around other bodies in orbit are not making circles or even ellipses, as you see here in this diagram. It all sort of works out neatly when you consider them as ellipses, but in fact, if you trace the path of, say, the moon, and if you just look at that path of the moon, it actually makes sort of spiral or sinusoidal or like sine wave patterns through the sky and through the cosmos. Now, the more complex you get, so as in, you've got the moon orbiting the Earth, that's pretty complex. But then when you add the Earth orbiting the Sun, that makes it even more complex. And when you have the Sun orbiting the galactic center at some freakish angle, that makes it even more complex. Then when you have the galaxy hauling balls at over 1 million miles an hour in some, uncertain direction, that makes animating this thing all the more difficult. But we haven't even gotten all the way to the moon yet. So the moon is also on the same plane, more or less, as the Earth and the sun. This is, of course, by the way, one of the main reasons why I don't have that big of a problem with animating the heliocentric model in a 2D environment. Again, even according to mainstream theoretical physics, the galaxy is certainly essentially a plane, and the solar system is certainly essentially a plane. And so, really the only major intersection of planes is fairly easy to calculate. It's just a 60-degree angle where the alleged so-called non-existing solar plane or ecliptical passes through the galactic plane at supposedly a 60-degree angle. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a 66.6 degree angle, but much like the Earth's angle off of the horizontal axis, but I digress. Anyway, I just thought that I would point that out. A lot of people argue against using a two-dimensional program to animate three-dimensional, heliocentric model, but in fact, it's really pretty accurate to do that. And in fact, there are ways that you can even have, you can work in multiple planes or almost in a 3D sort of environment, even in Flash. Now, I've said it before, but a few years ago, I got pretty good with 3D Studio Max in terms of modeling objects and animating. So I did learn my way around it. It took me a couple of weeks of, thoroughly going through video training manuals and really dedicating myself to it. And I did a few projects with it, a few play things, play fun projects with it, and then some business projects with it. And then I put it down and didn't use the software again for years. And, if you've ever used AutoCAD or specifically 3D Studio Max, you'll know that it's not like most typical Microsoft or Adobe products or such that, you can pretty much put them down and mess around with other similar products and other software and then pick right back up with your Adobe or Microsoft stuff, because most of the hotkeys are the same, and you're usually working in a two-dimensional environment, and there's lots of complexities involved with working in 3D and applying textures to where you really have to dedicate yourself to it and focus on it in order to become proficient with it, which I really do want to get back into, and I am back to practicing at it, but I'm just not back to that point to where I'm proficient in it. I wouldn't even say that I ever got to a point where I was proficient in it, but I did get to a point where I could, model things in 3D that I wanted to model, and I could animate them and animate the cameras, and that's pretty basic stuff. Use different sorts of lighting, and so that's the basics of it. But really, when you're talking about 3 spheres, for example, that's really about as basic as it gets. So I've even done some preliminary stuff that's starting to look pretty good. But I just want to get a little bit better with my textures and my use of lighting and background and stuff before I start, and also the accuracy of my measurements and angles and such before I start putting out any 3D animations. But look forward to those, and certainly look forward to some 2D animations of my sort of newfound knowledge of the false heliocentric theory, intricate details of the compounded lies, where they have indeed at some point placed the ecliptical or the solar plane at a 60-degree angle to the galactic plane, which I do remember. I think I remember learning that at some point, which is why whenever I've considered things like the spinning Earth and the spinning sun going around the galaxy, I've always considered it in both ways of thought. In other words, I've considered it with the solar plane or the ecliptical being in alignment or in accordance with the galactic plane, as well as at some other angle. I believe I used 90 degrees, or it was really probably closer to 60, but I said 90 degrees. But anyways, we know that the false way to look at it is that everything in the solar system that we're concerned with, being the sun, the earth, and the moon, are all essentially on the same plane. You've got the tilt of the earth that sort of causes some confusion in that regard, but we're still essentially on the same plane, and the moon remains essentially on the same plane, but also adds further to the confusion because it can stray plus or minus, within a 5-degree range of that ecliptic plane. Theoretically speaking, of course, we're just simply testing the heliocentric hypothesis, and with this sort of information, it should be fairly easy to animate and show how it's physically impossible. So you notice I put that sort of pink square behind the moon, the earth, and the sun, and I provided sort of shaded areas where the orbits intersect, just to sort of show the eye that all of these objects are on the same plane. Okay, now the moon's orbit does diverge from the ecliptic by about 5 degrees, and I'm not sure if it's 2.5 degrees in either direction, but it's 5 degrees divergent, which is not much in the grand scheme of things. And so you can essentially say that the moon is indeed orbiting the Earth on the same plane that the Earth is orbiting the sun, on the same plane that the sun is orbiting the galactic center, although the sun is not orbiting the galactic center on the same plane as the rest of the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Nor is it appearing to travel in a direction similar to the motion of the so-called arms of the galaxy. Again, this is all theoretical, of course, but we're humoring the heliocentric model for a scientific scrutiny. That's what science is all about. Even though the heliocentric model is a futile, ridiculous, preposterous waste of time, it is what most people believe. So, when in Rome, I don't see how the sun can be orbiting at a 60-degree angle up and above the galactic plane at 483,000 miles an hour and be traveling around the center of the galactic plane at over 500,000 miles per hour at the same time. But I guess that's what they're purporting, because if everything in the Milky Way galaxy is orbiting the center, then that would include the sun in its peculiar 60-degree orbit to the galactic plane, right? It would have to. So the sun is not only orbiting, at this peculiar 60 degrees, but it would also necessarily be making some kind of a strange corkscrew, sinusoidal, very bizarre pattern through, the sky if you follow the trace of the line that it made. This is going to be very interesting to animate, and it's really surprising that you can't find too many really good animations of how this whole solar system thing works. The best you'll find are animations where the sun is moving very slowly and the earth is moving very quickly and the moon is moving much more quickly than any of it, and that's really the only way such a thing can work. You can't have a slower moon orbiting around a faster earth orbiting around a faster sun. You can't demonstrate it on a computer screen, just like it can't occur in reality. There are certain things that are physically possible, and there are certain things that are physically impossible. And unfortunately, orbital mechanics are physically impossible in an Einsteinian gravitational sense. Now, I can see something like electromagnetism producing something akin to orbit, but I don't think that the sun and the moon, and certainly not the Earth, are gravitationally bound objects, nor do I think that the far distant spirals in the night sky, these so called galaxies, are gravitationally bound objects either, because, again, well, gravity doesn't exist. And so, if they are bound by anything, it's probably closer akin to electromagnetism and certainly nothing to do with gravity whatsoever. So, this is sort of odd and peculiar, and I suppose that modern physicists will tell you lots of solar systems that dwell within spiral galaxies have their ecliptics at odd angles to the, plane of the spiral, but I digress. I've never been to another galaxy, and in fact, I don't even think such thing as galaxies exist. As a matter of fact, nobody in the world ever believed or even thought of a thing called a galaxy other than possibly the, universe which we dwell in until 1929 when Hubble postulated the idea of other galaxies. And so that's where we get a lot of this total craziness. But just to sort of review this diagram again, because it is an important point to keep in mind, and I am planning on animating this accurately, and you can do it accurately in a two-dimensional environment. It just makes it a little bit more difficult when you've got, let's see, 1 moving parts, 2 moving parts, 3 moving parts, 4 moving parts that are all going in conflicting, opposing directions. The smallest of the moving parts are supposedly the slowest, yet they somehow are faster than the largest and fastest moving parts. So let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. If you look at an animation of, say, the sun traveling in a curve, just a portion of a curve around the galactic center, and we'll just worry about the sun, the moon, and the earth in this example. So you've got the sun just basically traveling sort of along a very, very shallow curve, so nearly a straight line, just a barely curved line. The sun is going extremely fast, almost 500,000 miles an hour. So in order to demonstrate that on a computer screen, you can't do it to scale. You have to slow it down. Now, the issue is that makes this all the more preposterous is that in order to make orbital animations work with software like Flash or any other animation software, is you have to make the host body, such as the sun, you have to make it travel slowly through the animation, and then you have to have its satellite body, for example the Earth, travel much more swiftly than the sun by default. And remember, this is in a situation where the sun is slowed down disproportionately so that it can be animated. You can't have a 500,000 mile an hour sun going across the screen. Now, if you scale everything down, proportionately so it fits on the screen, let's say the sun travels at 5 inches an hour, or 5 inches a minute. Well, since it's going about 10 times faster than the Earth, then that means that the Earth would have to be traveling about 5 inches every 10 minutes. And in order to get that to work in an animation, I'm not sure how you could do it. Again, the only way to get these sort of orbital animations to work is either to consider them in a stationary situation where everything's just going in circles or going in ellipses. But when you actually understand that these objects are all hauling ass, and the smaller satellite bodies are supposedly much slower than the larger host bodies, yet the only way we can animate this so that it actually looks like bodies orbiting larger bodies is if we take the largest, fastest bodies and slow them down to much, much slower than the slowest, smallest bodies in order to get it to even be physically possible. Now, even in skewing everything in the opposite way that it should be, so in other words, the galaxy should be the fastest object zipping across the screen, while the moon should be the slowest object barely moving at all, according to the heliocentric model, and yet we have to do the exact opposite in order to get the animation to work. So, in other words, we have to slow the fastest galaxy down to a near crawl. Then we have to slow the next fastest object, the sun, down to slightly more than a near crawl. And then the next smaller, slower body, the Earth, orbits the sun fairly quickly. And then the tiniest, slowest satellite object, at this point it's a fourth generation satellite body, the moon, the smallest, tiniest, slowest object, in order for the animation to work, must be the fastest object by far. And keep in mind, this is in a situation where everything has been skewed inversely. So, in other words, if you were to use the actual speeds to scale of all of these, different objects moving in different conflicting directions, what you would wind up with is a galaxy 500 light years over that way, a sun 300 light years, in that direction, an Earth, a light year back that way, and a moon, a light year way back over there. Because, again, orbital mechanics simply don't work, even in animations where we give this whole thing so many benefits of the doubt and so many, just freebies, gimmies. It's really no wonder nobody ever tries to accurately animate what's going on with the galaxy and what's going on with the orbit of the sun and the planets and the moon, because it doesn't make any sense. I could have sort of seen this thing making some degree of sense if the elliptical or the solar plane or the orbital plane was aligned with the galactic plane. But since that's at a 60-degree angle to the galactic plane, it really just throws so much more complexity into the mix, because the sun traveling at, say, 500,000 miles an hour around, that center with one of these arms of the galaxy, it's going at nearly a right angle, and actually a 60-degree angle in towards that mishmash of stars going around the center of the galaxy. So it appears to be sort of a black sheep of the galaxy. But at any rate, when you consider furthermore that the Earth is on that same plane or the same ecliptic as the sun, and the moon is more or less, 5 degrees off, is not much, on the same plane as the Earth and the sun as well, then it really goes to show, and it makes a lot of sense to me, but I'll sort of have to animate this to show you guys what I mean, how this is physically impossible. Einstein's relativity doesn't solve this. You simply cannot have slower, smaller objects beating out faster objects by many orders of magnitude, simply because of this idea of relativity and space-time and, gravitational fields. For one thing, gravity has never been proven, demonstrated, or even observed Sure, we've already talked about Cavendish and that debacle, but in all honesty, the natural laws of density and buoyancy explain what goes up must come down perfectly well, without the need for any theoretical chains to hold us stuck to the side of a spinning sphere, going over 1,000 miles an hour near the equator. Which, we hadn't even factored that into this little situation here. You have to add that into the mix as well. Now, one thing that I'll mention here, since again, this is a relatively accurate, obviously it's not to scale, but it's a relatively accurate depiction of what's occurring in the galaxy and in our solar system and in our orbit around the sun and in the moon's orbit around the Earth. This is a fairly accurate depiction. And as you know, this is all very much theoretical. I don't mean these are viable answers, I just mean these are the mainstream theoretical fantasies of the day. Now, if you can imagine racing against an Olympic runner, that let's say he could run 5 times faster than you. And let's just say you guys are running around a curved track. Now, let's say at the start of the race, you keep up with him for a bit, and he starts to outrun you. He starts to get ahead of you. Now, let's say hypothetically you were able to gain the second wind and catch up with the guy that could run 5 times faster than you. Not only catch up with him, but run faster than him, get way out in front of him in terms of the race, and then turn around on the track, run the opposite direction towards him while he continues running in the right direction. You turn around and start running back towards him. And then after he, passes you and starts kicking your butt again in the race, you turn around and start heading the correct direction again. Even though he can run 5 times faster than you, how many times do you think you'd be able to do this? Well, I'll tell you for sure that you never even would have caught up with him in the first place. He can run 5 times faster than you. Now, if he was tugging you along with a rope, say that's gravity, and you were on roller skates, I could see you somehow keeping up with him and maybe even gaining on him. But then once you looped around the front of him, even with the rope still attached, then turned around and traveled in the opposite direction as him as he continued to travel in the correct direction 5 times faster than you're capable of running, and then you looped around the back of him, how many times do you think you could do this? This is exactly why gravity doesn't work. And by the way, this is just a minor example. The moon supposedly travels at about 2,000 miles an hour. The Earth travels supposedly about 30 times faster than that, if I'm doing my half-brain math correctly, but at 66,600 miles per hour. So the Earth supposedly travels many orders of magnitude faster than the moon upon the same plane, mind you. And yet, that's just peanuts compared to the sun, which travels roughly 9 or 10 times faster than the Earth. So you've got yet another order of magnitude well above and beyond that of the moon. And yet, under certain circumstances, and again, I will try to diagram this out to scale in terms of speeds, which is going to be very difficult, and in fact impossible to do, because you simply cannot have a slower body beating around in circles, running rings around a faster body. It just doesn't work It doesn't work with relativity. It doesn't work with gravity, especially considering gravity is merely a theory that has never been proven or even observed. So now that we've sort of studied this, galactic model, I think it's even more laughable than I ever thought it was before. Now, again, all of this stuff isn't to scale, but don't you think it's kind of odd that we supposedly live in a spiral galaxy where most of the objects are oriented sort of in a plane or in a dish shape, spinning around the center of the galaxy, and yet our little solar system is sort of, wedged into the heart of the galaxy at a 60-degree angle. I do remember hearing some theoretical physicists postulating that we may be part of a binary galaxy system or even a binary solar system, which they say could explain things like comets or, this angle that we have towards the galactic center, I would suppose. But at the end of the day, this bizarre cockamamie compacted lies on top of lies on top of lies to make this heliocentric model work is this very peculiar, almost laughable model of the universe that all people believe to be true and correct because they were taught it since they were toddlers. But I can pretty much guarantee you that most people have never even considered the Milky Way galaxy or the solar plane to this level. In fact, me myself, being a fairly avid science geek, had never really delved this deeply into the supposed goings-on of the Milky Way galaxy and the solar system and that relationship. And so this is very enlightening to me in terms of what they're claiming in the heliocentric model, because it seems like there should be some key pieces of information in here that, force them into laboring to make their model work so that you have this very odd and peculiar and unnatural sort of phantom of a model that is designed to always assume the theories to be correct without ever searching for proof of the theories or without ever finding proof of the theories, and somehow claiming that the original observations which led to the postulation of the theory to begin with as somehow proof of the theory. So, in other words, Newton observed what goes up must come down. He said that was because of gravity. When an apple falls from the tree, that doesn't prove gravity is an accurate theory. It just proves that the original observation was correct. What goes up must come down here on the ground, on the physical plane, in reality. Two other examples are evolution and gravity. Gravity is a theory that theoretical physicists are still trying to find, and just a couple weeks ago they sent out some bogus images of two supposed black holes colliding and becoming one singular black hole.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have detected gravitational waves. We did it.
Wait a minute, I thought Einsteinian gravity was a fact of life, like water is wet. So up until a few days ago, there was this big question as to whether gravity was real or just an imaginary theory. Did we actually need a standing ovation to prove this, fact of life known as gravity? What's the big deal if they found evidence for gravity, if it's been this well-known thing this whole time? It would be like announcing to the world, we have discovered that water is wet or fire is hot. Right?
We did it.
I am so pleased to be able to tell you that. So these gravitational waves were produced by two colliding black holes. Came together, urged to form a single black hole about 1.3 billion years ago. They were detected by LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. LIGO is the most precise measuring device, in ever built. Let me start with what we saw. So on September 14th, 2015, the two LIGO observatories in Hanford, Washington and Livingston, Louisiana recorded a signal nearly at the same time, nearly simultaneously, and the signal had a very specific characteristic. The characteristic of, as time went forward, the frequency went up. And what was amazing about this signal is that it's exactly what you would expect, what Einstein's theory of general relativity would predict for two big massive objects like black holes in spiraling and merging together. Now, it took us months of careful checking, rechecking, analysis, looking at every piece of data to make sure that what we saw was not something that wasn't a gravitational wave, but in fact it was a gravitational wave. And we've convinced ourselves that's the case, and we're here to announce that today. So I'm going to show you two videos that are going to sort of tell you what we discovered. So the first video is the two black holes. So what you're looking at on the screen here are two black holes. Each of them are about 30 solar mass, have about 30 times the mass of the sun. All right, and you're looking, the black holes are the black things in the middle, and you're looking at the stars behind them. By the way, this is not a Hollywood production that I'm going to show you. It is actually a real computer simulation solving Einstein's equations for these merging black holes. So this is really what it would look like if you were in a spaceship close up. And I will also point out that the movie I'm showing is vastly slowed down relative to what happened here. So let me start it. All right, you can see that as the black holes spin around each other, all right, the stars behind them are warped, and that's because the strong gravitational fields bend the light that comes around. But what I want you to pay attention to in this video is the fact that as they orbit, the black holes are getting closer and closer to one another. The orbit is speeding up, and eventually they're going to merge. The event horizons are going to join, boom. They produce one big black hole, which relaxes, and you see a little bit of vibration there. It becomes two smaller black holes die, one bigger black hole is born. Now, what's really amazing about this is the first time that this kind of a system has ever been seen, a binary black hole merger, and it's proof that binary black holes exist in the universe. So I want to put this in perspective for you because I think it's very important, all right, to give a sense of what we've convinced ourselves really happened here.
I would rather ask a blind man about his favorite color to get a sense of what's happening here than to go to you to get a sense of what's happening here. Now, in that little video computer-generated animation that you put up on your little screen in the background there, supposedly proving that black holes exist and proving that gravity exists. First of all, it was a cartoon. No, that's not what it would look like if you were in a spaceship up there. But according to him, we were looking at two black holes merging into one larger black hole, which is the most ridiculous thing you can possibly imagine because gravity doesn't exist. Therefore, you know, huge punctures in the space-time continuum due to overwhelming amounts of gravity after a star collapses, for example. All of that is just theoretical folly. It could never actually occur in reality. Again, because there is no such thing as gravity in terms of a warping or even a piercing of the so-called fabric of space-time. Now, looking at the image I've got here, this is a very generic representation of what we were witnessing on their so-called black hole event. Now, he said that the black hole scenario was from, I believe, 1.3 billion years ago. I'll have to double check that, but I believe he said 1.3 billion years ago.
1.3 billion years ago.
So that means the objects are 1.3 billion light years, which is pretty darn distant. Now, one thing about black holes that everybody knows is that it's such highly dense gravity and such powerful gravity that not even light can escape. That's how powerful the gravity of a black hole is. But that's light that's coming towards the black hole. So just looking at the diagram, the outer edge, that yellow highlighted outer edge of the black hole would be called the event horizon. And what that is if light waves, even coming in at an angle, not necessarily directly coming towards that black hole, get near that event horizon, the light is actually going to be sucked in and sucked into the black hole. So it'll just appear like a black hole. That's why they call it a black hole, because it supposedly, theoretically, would make everything behind it look black, because not even light can escape a black hole. Now, this whole idea of light being attracted by gravity is sort of a point of contention for me, because you'd think we'd see evidence for it. For example, the center of our so-called Milky Way galaxy is supposedly a supermassive black hole. So, since all of the objects in our so-called galaxy are gravitationally bound by the, so-called alleged supermassive black hole at the center, then shouldn't all light waves sort of have a propensity or a tendency towards the center of the galaxy? If light waves were attracted by gravity, then shouldn't the gravitational lensing, as predicted by Einstein during the eclipse event, which they used as proof of gravity, but if the sun's gravity is actually sucking in light from surrounding stars or from background stars, which light comes near its gravity field, then shouldn't that light get sucked into the sun and not bend around the sun as if it was magnetically repelled away from the sun? This is a pretty standard diagram of the phenomenon that is so-called gravitational lensing. Essentially, to me, it defies all logic and common sense if you're thinking of things in a heliocentric or Einsteinian sort of philosophical way, where gravity is this force that must be attracting all objects and all even, sort of semi-physical electromagnetic waves such as light. But gravity must be attracting everything towards a central point of mass. So in this example here, the normal position of the star on top, beaming directly at the Earth in a straight line, that makes sense, sort of considering space-time as this rectilinear thing. However, when the sun gets in the way, and then this is only visible during an eclipse, because usually you can't see the stars during the daytime, but during the eclipse, what happens is the star or a star that should be behind the sun appears like aside or above the sun, or it actually appears when, again, it should be behind the sun. So that's Einstein used that as proof of gravity. He used that prediction as proof of gravity, but actually it's quite the opposite of what you would expect if gravity were true. Now, you could argue that it's a warping of space-time, and so the electromagnetic waves, the light waves, are just sort of following that curvilinear path, and they're not attracted in towards the sun, but that defies what gravity is. Yes, it is supposedly a warping of space-time, but once you get caught into a gravity wave, at what point does it actually affect you to where you become part of that mass? The sun is supposedly so strong and robust in its gravity that it keeps our planet stupid around in orbits, as well as far more distant, far smaller planets such as Pluto and the asteroid belt in orbit. So if light is actually attracted by gravity, which according to them it obviously is, because that's the whole thing with the black hole, is that the gravity of the black hole is sucking in all the light around it from all of these stars that just so happen to be behind it. But, looking at my, poorly done, agreed diagram, but it does sort of show the point that if gravity were this sucking in towards the center of all things, then gravitational lensing, as predicted by Einstein and proven during that eclipse, it actually proves the contrary. It proves that Einstein was wrong. Just to unpack that claim a little bit more, Einstein basically predicted an effect called gravitational lensing, which basically you can see in this diagram here that he predicted that a star that normally would be directly behind the sun would appear, further away from the outside of the sun. So he, for some reason, predicted that the star that would normally be, say, half obscured by the sun during an eclipse, since we can see the stars, during an eclipse, but not during the day, then the apparent position of that star should change, and it should move away to the outside of the sun, or move away from the sun. Now, this is the exact opposite of what you would expect if gravity was this constant sucking in of all things, including light, apparently. On a quick side note, let's just say hypothetically that Einstein knew ahead of time, prior to that eclipse, prior to making the prediction. What if he already knew that stars changed their apparent position when near the sun, or when the sun is sort of in front of stars during an eclipse? What if he already knew that they changed apparent positions? And what if he very dubiously sort of wove that into his theory as a prediction? Because it totally does debunk his prediction, debunk the theory of relativity and the theory of gravity. It honestly does. The so-called gravitational lensing debunks the theory completely, and so it was almost necessary and very clever of him, or the society that he represented, or the society that propped him up and backed him, but it was very clever of them to use this probably foreknown, knowledge of how stars apparently change their position during eclipse events, but use that to their advantage as, in the form of a prediction, and they predicted it to occur as they knew it would occur, although the way that it occurs is contrary to the theory of gravity. So if you sort of see what I'm saying here, it was necessary for them to preemptively squash this disproof of gravity by using it as one of their theories to prove gravity in the first place. Very clever. So if you look at the second diagram here, it shows what we should actually expect to see, the actual position of the star, but during an eclipse event, the gravity from the sun should attract that light from that star in towards the sun, but instead it does exactly the opposite. So again, I do understand the counter arguments to this. People will say that the electromagnetic waves, or the light, is just sort of riding along the curved linear space-time thanks to the warping due to the massive object. But again, if gravity is this ceaseless, very powerful yet very weak attraction towards the center of an object, then that is not what we see when we observe the so-called gravitational lensing during an eclipse. And there is some debate and contention about this, but if you actually think about this logically model it out. The star that's behind the sun should not appear, around the sides of the sun because of gravitational lensing. It should go the other way around. It should go stars that are close to the edge of the sun yet visible, so like off to the right a little bit of the sun. That star should be invisible. It should be, apparently the light should be sucked in towards the sun, but instead we see the opposite of that, and it's almost as if gravitational lensing, instead of an attraction, is almost a repulsion. So how can gravity possibly repel light? And again, I understand the counter-argument to this is that light is traveling through curved linear space-time, which is curved by the sun, but I'm sorry, if that measly, extremely light, very, opposite of dense light passes right next to the sun, if you're telling me that the overwhelming gravitational force of the sun is incapable of even collecting a single photon or lots of photons, then that tells me that the sun is not a gravitational device. Well, for one thing, gravity doesn't exist. It's never been demonstrated, never been proven, and in fact, all experimentation in order to try and support or validate gravity always disproves it. Now, again, what goes up must come down is indeed a logical and accurate and astute observation. However, you cannot use that observation as proof of any theory that explains the observation. I could say, what comes up must come down. I could say that is due to density and buoyancy, which it is, but something more exotic. Let's say there are demons in the sky that don't want things floating up, that push everything back down, and that theory is about as valid as the theory of gravity, because it can't be demonstrated, tested, or proven, and really any study or experimentation into the matter is contrary to the theory. So much like there is probably not demons in the sky causing what goes up must come down to occur, so too gravity is very much likened to this theory, to where you cannot demonstrate it, you can't falsify it, and you certainly can never prove a theoretical fantasy which has the validity as, again, my favorite armor in Dark Souls, which is the Smelter Demon armor, or the equivalent invalidity to the dream of a fart. This theoretical physics thing loves to cherry pick their arguments, and it also seems they love to have their cake and eat it too. I'm terribly sorry, but you just can't have a 1.3 billion light year distant black hole object with nothing but stars behind it. So in other words, there are no stars in front of it, according to our perspective. Now, you could argue that it was such a small frame of reality, but come on, so you're telling me that it just so happens that frame of the little section of the universe that's only visible from telescopes by NASA and only visible if you use computer-generated imaging. It's not what you actually see. You can't even see any of this. It's just an artist's rendering of this alleged theoretical event. But even in that small sector of the universe that we're focusing in upon for this black hole event, it just appears to me as if every single star in that frame is more distant than the black hole. So I'm trying to figure out how that works. If the black hole is 1.3 billion light years away, then surely there are billions and billions of stars that are closer to us than that. And since it's further away, you have to obviously zoom in on a smaller area to see it clearly. But again, we're not even zoomed in on anything. It's just a CGI rendering. So My point of contention is just with the artists who rendered that. It would have been smart of you to put at least one or two stars that happen to be in front of the black holes. Your little animation makes absolutely no sense. But of course, lies usually tend not to make sense. So, theoretically, of course. Now, what you'll have to admit is that any stars being perturbed or being blotted out by this event horizon, or especially the singularity itself, would need to be more distant or further away from you, the observer, than the black hole event itself. So, in other words, if you notice in my little diagram here, you've got three little stars that are in between the event, the black hole, and the Earth. Now, those three stars wouldn't be affected whatsoever in terms of your observation because the light coming from those stars, first of all, the stars would be much closer to you than 1.8 billion light years away, and so the light heading towards you from those much nearer stars would hit your eye just as they normally would have. So technically, there should have been at least one or two stars that were not more distant than the 1.8 billion light year distant black hole event. So in other words, everything, all that warping, and actually that's exactly what it looked like, is it looked like just a simple warp effect. It's a very easy computer generated effect that you can do with any video software or even any animated image editing software. It's not that difficult to do. Twist and warp images with computers, and in fact, even the gentleman doing the narration there admitted that it was a computer-generated animation. So it doesn't prove anything. I mean, I can give you a computer-generated animation of the flat, stationary Earth, and it certainly can make sense, and it certainly can show how things work, but it doesn't prove it. Proof is never achieved through computer-generated animations. You can only convey ideas or demonstrate principles or, recreate experiments or, describe things in sort of a visual fashion with animations, but you're never going to really prove something with a 3D animation. Now, back to that diagram, you'll notice that first of all, 1.8 billion light years is extremely distant. And so you never would be able to see that event with the naked eye from the Earth. The furthest we can see is about 4,000 light years, which is only a fraction of a percentage of the distance of that so-called supposed event where we had two black holes colliding and becoming one single black hole. Now, the fact that it isn't real footage should tell you something. The fact that it is computer-generated animation should tell you something. And the fact that all of the stars that the two black holes happen to transit all appear to be behind these very, very distant black holes. Again, otherwise, if any of the stars were closer to us than those black holes, then the light coming towards us from those closer stars would not be sucked back into that black hole. That's not how it works. The light has to come near the event horizon in order to be sucked into the black hole. Light isn't going to be sucked millions of light years through space backwards. Okay, so it's very good evidence to me that that whole thing, well, of course it was a computer generated image, but it wasn't even accurate, because the people who did the computer generated image should have at least thought to put some stars closer to the observer than the black hole event, because again, we're looking at very, very distant stars. Surely there are plenty of stars between our eye and that black hole, but nope, according to that animation, all the stars are behind the black hole event. And how convenient is that for their pretty little black hole event that supposedly proves gravity, but all it does is prove that people can use computer generated animations to show an idea, This is ridiculous. You people can't even prove the Earth possesses a single degree of curvature, nor can you prove that it spins even at 1 single mile per hour axially, nor can you prove that it races around the sun at over 66,600 miles an hour on average, nor can you prove that the sun is traveling, at a 60-degree angle to the galactic plane at 483,000 miles an hour, while simultaneously spiraling around the center of the galaxy in one of its arms at over 500,000 miles per hour at the same time, while the galaxy has never shown any evidence to be traveling at 1.3 million miles per hour through space. In fact, we can easily demonstrate that the ground that you're standing on right now has never moved a single yard ever. So the idea that we can somehow figure out what happened 1.3 billion years ago is theoretical folly at best. So if that black hole event occurred 1.3 billion years ago, then how old are the stars that are ostensibly many light years beyond and behind those two black holes? The whole thing looked like a cartoon to me, and I know for a fact that gravity doesn't exist, and so therefore theoretical fantasies such as Einstein-Rosen bridges, dark matter, dark energy, and yes, even black holes, theoretically couldn't possibly exist, and theoretically things like gravity and dark matter don't even need to exist because we don't live on a spinning globe, and the natural laws of density and buoyancy just sort of take care of where the order of things go. It's the natural order of things. Nature is balance personified. I mean, if you could think of one word to describe nature, it would have to be balance, or at least me personally. But anyway, I'm sort of digressing. I hope I didn't bore you guys too much with this galaxy model here, but I just thought it was sort of amusing, and I am going to be doing some further work and animations into this model of theirs because I intend to show that not only is it preposterous and impossible, but anybody that even remotely applies themselves to, trying to animate a situation where you have very large, very fast, high velocity objects being, run around in circles by much smaller, slower objects, I'd love to see it. Even with relativity in mind, it's physically impossible. It's never going to be proven because it's all theoretical fantasy. Anyway, hopefully you can just check the ground you're walking upon, realize that there is no curvature regardless of altitude, realize that you're not spinning, realize that the world is a plane, it's not a planet, and then maybe we can start, actually finding answers to some of these big questions. I believe firmly that one of the main reasons we don't have answers to the real important questions in life is because our society has been set up in such a manner that the brightest minds, the most dedicated people, are forced into a system where they pay their entire lives into a debt system, especially those who attend very expensive colleges and end up owing, federal and student loans for the rest of their lives. But these people, unfortunately, must conform to this preposterous model in order to be considered rational, sane people. And that's sort of a shame, but if a person can actually take the time to just be a little bit scientific, give the good old globe model a skeptical scrutiny, and also apply the scientific method to the notion or the theory that the Earth is a stationary plane, and I can assure you that you're not wasting your time because science is never a waste of time. Science if performed correctly, will only ever lead you closer to the truth. You will either find evidence to support a theory, or you'll find evidence that is, contradicts a theory, or even falsifies a theory. But there is no room for enemies or friends in this, allies and enemies. This is simply science. This is how we rational, skeptical human beings figure things out using empirical evidence and repeatable experiments. There is no battle or war going on here. We just want to fully understand the truth, and the best way to begin doing that is to completely debunk the heliocentric model, which is sort of my primary mission, and of course to provide good solid evidence that the stationary plane Earth is the plain, simple truth. Just wanted to quickly thank everyone for taking the time to hang with me in this, 3-hour video. It took a long time to make it. Hopefully it won't take that long to render it, and I'll hopefully have it up by the weekend. That's the first weekend in March, here coming up in just a few hours, actually. As you guys know, I'm doing the weekly show Static Plane Truth tomorrow. That's every Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern. So don't forget to check that out. Also, if you dare, check out the Facebook page that's run by a friend of mine. Definitely check out $5,000 NASA Eclipse Challenge. I'm doing a video, or actually am in the middle of working on a video involving the data that's the crux of the $5,000 NASA Eclipse Challenge, so be on the lookout for that soon. I've actually got that in the works. It's just a lot of material, and I am wanting to incorporate 3D modeling into the video, so I may end up having to settle for 2D, which again, as I've mentioned, is adequate because more or less the Earth, Moon, and Sun are all essentially always on the same plane, more or less, and things like tilt and even a 5-degree angle of the Moon's supposed or alleged orbit can be accounted for in a 2D animation, so I may end up just going 2D on that. Again, I'm no master with Flash either, so we shall see. I'm still in the editing process of that. We've got all the recording done. We've got all the data. Everything's there, and the $5,000 NASA Eclipse Challenge Facebook page is up, so definitely check that out. If you guys are looking to tithe, as always, I mention the Shelter of God Sunday School. Just go to www.sogss.com. Shelter of God Sunday School. It's run by my friend Majida in Pakistan, and just a little bit really does go a long way. So anybody that's wanting to help out the children over there in Pakistan who really need it, it is a Christian outreach organization. So there's that. And last but certainly not least, I just found out today, the final day when I'm wrapping up editing on this film, that my stepdad died yesterday, and so I just want to sort of dedicate this video to Steve. I'm gonna miss you, buddy. Love you, man, and definitely just dedicate this one to you. I wish you could have been around to see it. So, since you were honestly one of the funniest people I've ever known, I think it's fitting to sort of wrap this up with a joke. So the Pope gets off a plane, and he gets in the back of the limo, and they take off out of the airport. And before they're getting on the highway, the Pope bangs on the glass, and the driver rolls down the window. The Pope tells the limo driver, "Let me up front, I want to drive." And the limo driver goes, "Well, no way. There's no way. You're the Pope. I'm the limo driver, and I'm going to do the driving." You sit back there and do the poping. So a few minutes later, the Pope just insisted on it. He said, listen, man, I never get out. I never get to drive. Nobody ever lets me drive. And I just want to drive from the airport to my house. Is that so much to ask? I mean, I'm paying you well. So the limo driver pulls over and gets him back and lets the Pope drive. So the Pope floors it and starts driving like a maniac, gets right back on the freeway. He's doing 80. He's doing 90. He's doing 110. So he's got the limo driver pretty well scared, but quickly enough, whoop whoop, they get pulled over. And being the Pope, of course, he's a law-abiding citizen. He pulls over, and the police officer obviously marches up to the front of the limo to the driver's side, taps on the tinted glass window, and the Pope rolls down the window. And so the police officer, a little bit astonished, says, "Sir, do you know why I pulled you over?" And the Pope says, well, yeah, I know I was speeding. And so the officer goes back to his car, gets on the phone with dispatch, and he says, I need to talk to the chief. So he gets on the horn with the chief, and he says, Chief, I got a pretty big one here. And the chief says, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, you're not going to believe this, but I've got the big one. And he says, well, what, a celebrity? And he said, no, way bigger than a celebrity. And he says, well, what, a politician? He says, no, it's not a politician. Now, I don't know what the deal is, but whoever this is, he's got the Pope as his freaking chauffeur. Everyone out there, if you'd like to help me in my efforts to continue making videos such as this, living isn't free. And so I do include some advertisements with my videos, limited advertisements. I don't like to, I don't want to be the channel that you have to sit through non-skippable ad every 15 minutes like some do. So my ad revenue isn't that great, but the community has really been keeping me going. It's because of the community that I keep making flat earth proof videos. People want me to keep doing it, and people that want to help or people that would like to contribute to my efforts can do so directly via PayPal. If you're familiar with PayPal, it's real easy. You can just send any amount to John Elance at Gmail through PayPal. That's JONELANCE, John Elance at gmail.com. Or you can actually contribute to the channel directly through the YouTube fan funding option, although that is not really preferred. YouTube sort of uses it as a punishment device. So if I get another copyright strike, I will lose that privilege. At any rate, if you don't like PayPal, or if you can't use PayPal, there is always the option to support this channel through YouTube fan funding. So thank you guys so much for your time. God bless. As always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out.
Funky bass, Johnny.
Just like seeing the colors of trance and feeling the power of acid. Trance and acid. Trance and acid. Acid. Trance and acid. Hearing the music is just like seeing the colors of trance and feeling the power of acid. Trance and
Ain't it funky? 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 1, 2, 3, 4.
Not something that wasn't a gravitational wave, but in fact it was a gravitational wave. And we've convinced ourselves that's the case, and we're here to announce that today. Most precise measuring device, 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 precise measuring device ever built.